Welcome, weary soul, to the sorrowful tale of Miquella the Unalloyed, most enigmatic of all the demigods who walked the lands between. Tonight we shall explore the complete story of this eternal child, blessed with boundless compassion and cursed with impossible dreams. This is a journey through divine affliction and sacred devotion, through love that transcends the boundaries of life and death itself. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow your mind to drift as we walk together through the tragic beauty of a God who sought to heal a broken world. There is no urgency here, no need to grasp every detail. Simply let the story wash over you like gentle rain upon parched earth. In the twilight years of the Golden Order, when Queen Marika the Eternal ruled from her throne within the Erd Tree and the very concept of death had been banished from the world, there occurred an event so strange and momentous that its implications would ripple through the ages like stones cast into still water. This was the union of divine flesh with itself, the convergence of two aspects of the same eternal being in a marriage that was both sacred sacrament and cosmic paradox. For Marika and Radagon, though they appeared to the world as separate individuals with their own histories and desires, their own triumphs and sorrows, were in truth two faces of a single divine consciousness, two expressions of one ineffable whole that existed beyond the understanding of mortal minds. Their union was not the joining of separate souls, but the recognition of an identity that had always existed, hidden beneath the veil of apparent duality that defined so much of existence in the lands between. This convergence of divine essence, this folding of godhood back upon itself, was an act pregnant with both tremendous creative potential and equally tremendous danger. For when the divine touches itself, when godhood looks into its own infinite depths and finds there its own reflection, the result is something that transcends the normal patterns of creation and enters into realms that even the gods themselves might fear to explore. From this singular union, this marriage of self to self, came forth two children who would bear within their very beings all the paradoxes and impossibilities that such a convergence might create. They were twins born from flesh that was simultaneously one and two, children whose parentage was both singular and dual, beings who carried within themselves the seeds of both divine potential and inevitable tragedy. The first of these children was Miquella, whose name would echo through the ages as a whisper of hope and a cry of sorrow in equal measure. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that this child was touched by something beyond the ordinary workings of fate, marked by a blessing that was simultaneously a curse, gifted with abilities that would prove to be both salvation and damnation for all who encountered him. Miquella emerged into the world bearing the aspect of eternal youth, his form frozen forever in the appearance of childhood, even as his mind and spirit possessed depths that would challenge the wisest sages and most ancient powers. This was not merely a physical peculiarity, but a fundamental aspect of his divine nature, for he embodied the very concept of nascence itself, the eternal state of becoming that never resolves into being, the perpetual spring that knows no summer. The word nascent speaks of something that is just beginning to emerge, displaying the first tentative signs of future potential, while remaining forever poised on the threshold of transformation. In Miquella, this quality was not temporary, but eternal, a state of being that defined not only his physical appearance, but the very essence of his existence. He was forever the child on the verge of becoming an adult, forever the student about to become the teacher, forever the seed that contains within itself the promise of the mighty tree it might one day become. This eternal nascence was not merely a charming quirk of divine nature, but something that carried profound implications for both Miquella himself and the world around him. For in remaining forever young, forever on the threshold of transformation. He maintained a connection to pure potential that most beings lose as they mature and crystallize into fixed forms. He was life in its most abundant and flexible state, consciousness unbound by the limitations that age and experience typically impose upon the soul. Yet this gift came with a price that would haunt every moment of his existence, for the eternal child must watch as the world around him grows and changes while he remains forever locked in the same state of becoming. He could learn and grow in knowledge and power, could develop wisdom that surpassed that of beings who had lived for millennia, but he could never experience the natural progression from one stage of life to another that gives existence its rhythm and meaning. Beside Miquella came his twin sister Melania, and in her the cosmic paradox of their birth found a different but equally tragic expression. Where Miquella was cursed with eternal stasis, Melania was afflicted with eternal decay, her body gradually consumed by the scarlet rot that represented not mere disease but the divine essence of corruption itself, the touch of an outer god whose very nature was antithetical to the Golden Order's vision of eternal perfection. The twins were like two sides of the same impossible coin, each representing a different aspect of the fundamental tension between stasis and change, preservation and transformation that lay at the heart of all existence. Miquella embodied the eternal moment of pure potential, while Melania lived in the eternal process of dissolution and decay. Together, they formed a perfect duality that reflected the deeper contradictions inherent in their singular parentage. From the earliest moments of their shared existence, the bond between the twins transcended the normal relationships between siblings and entered into something approaching the mystical. They were not merely brother and sister, but two aspects of a single truth, two expressions of the same divine tragedy, two souls forever linked by their shared affliction and their shared divinity. Melania, despite being cursed with the gradual consumption of her flesh by alien corruption, possessed a warrior's heart that blazed with determination and pride. She would grow to become perhaps the greatest sword fighter in all the lands between, her blade dancing through battles with a grace that seemed to mock the very rot that consumed her body. Yet for all her strength and skill, for all the legends that would grow around her prowess in combat, she never forgot that she was fundamentally defined by her role as Miquella's sister and protector. The scarlet rot that afflicted Melania was no ordinary disease that might be cured through conventional medicine or magical intervention. It was the manifestation of an outer god's influence, a divine corruption that sought to transform her into a vessel for powers that existed beyond the normal boundaries of the world. This rot was patient and inexorable, working its way through her body with the slow certainty of geological time, gradually claiming her limbs, her sight, and ultimately threatening to claim her very soul. Yet even as the rot consumed her physical form, Melania's spirit remained indomitable, her will to protect her brother burning with a flame that no corruption could extinguish. She learned to fight despite her growing blindness, to wield her blade even as the rot claimed her limbs, to find strength in love and devotion, even as her body betrayed her day by day. Her dedication to Miquella became the cornerstone of her identity, the unshakable foundation upon which she built a legend that would outlast empires. For Miquella, witnessing his beloved sister's gradual deterioration was perhaps the greatest torment his eternal youth could provide. He possessed a mind capable of grasping the most complex theories of divine law and cosmic order, could perceive truths that escaped even the wisest scholars of the Golden Order, yet he was powerless to halt the slow destruction of the one person he loved above all others. This helplessness in the face of Melania's suffering would become the driving force behind every decision he made, every path he chose to walk. The twins had been born as Empyreans, a designation that carried both tremendous honor and equally tremendous burden. To be an Empyrean was to be recognized by the mysterious Two Fingers as a candidate for godhood, a potential successor to Queen Marika, who might one day ascend to rule over a new age and reshape the world according to their own vision. This was not merely a political appointment or a matter of inherited privilege, but a recognition of fundamental spiritual capacity, an acknowledgement that these beings possessed the divine spark necessary to transcend mortality and enter into the realm of eternal rulership. Yet the same singular nature of their parentage that had made them valid candidates for godhood had also cursed them with afflictions that seemed designed to prevent them from ever achieving the greatness that their birthright suggested. It was as though the cosmos itself was ambivalent about their potential ascension, granting them the power to become gods, while simultaneously ensuring that the path to such transformation would be fraught with suffering and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The theological implications of their birth raised questions that even the most learned scholars of the Golden Order found difficult to answer. If Marika and Radagon were truly one being, then what did it mean for that being to reproduce with itself? Was this an act of divine self-creation, the god exploring the depths of its own nature through the medium of flesh and blood? Or was it something more troubling, a violation of cosmic law that inevitably produced children who bore the weight of divine transgression? Some whispered that the twins' afflictions were not accidents but punishments, the cosmos's way of balancing the scales after such a fundamental violation of natural order. Others suggested that their curses were actually blessings in disguise, divine gifts that would ultimately enable them to transcend the limitations that bound other beings to conventional patterns of existence. Still, others believed that Miquella and Millennia represented something entirely new under the sun, beings whose very existence opened doorways to possibilities that had never before been explored. What remained undeniable was that the twins carried within themselves a potential that was both magnificent and terrifying, a capacity for transformation that could reshape not only their own fates, but the destiny of the entire world. They were living paradoxes, children who embodied both the highest aspirations and deepest fears of divine ambition, beings whose every breath reminded the cosmos that even gods were not exempt from the fundamental tensions that defined all existence. As they grew from infants into children, though Miquella's growth would forever remain incomplete and Millennia's would be marked by progressive loss rather than natural development, it became clear that their bond was not merely emotional but metaphysical. They seemed to complement each other in ways that transcended normal sibling relationships, each providing what the other lacked, each serving as anchor and sail for the other's journey through the treacherous waters of divine destiny. Miquella's eternal youth granted him a perspective that remained forever fresh and hopeful, unencumbered by the cynicism that age and experience so often bring. He could look upon the world's suffering and see not evidence of fundamental brokenness, but proof of the need for healing, not confirmation of despair, but inspiration for compassion. His nascent nature allowed him to maintain a connection to pure possibility that made him uniquely suited to imagine solutions that more mature minds might dismiss as impossible. Millennia's gradual transformation through suffering gave her a wisdom that complemented her brother's eternal optimism, a hard-won understanding of the reality of pain and loss that kept his dreams tethered to the actual conditions of existence. She knew intimately the cost of hope, the price that must be paid for attempting to transform the world. Yet her knowledge of suffering only deepened her appreciation for her brother's vision of healing and renewal. Together, the twins formed a partnership that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, each drawing strength from the other while remaining forever conscious that their time together was both eternal and desperately finite. For while Miquella would remain forever young, forever poised on the threshold of transformation. Millennia's affliction ensured that their bond would be tested by forces beyond their control, that their love would be the stage upon which cosmic powers would play out dramas of corruption and redemption. In the early years of their existence, before the full implications of their divine nature had become manifest, there were moments of something approaching normal childhood happiness. They played together in the gardens of whatever palace or stronghold housed them, their laughter echoing through halls that had been built to accommodate the schemes of gods and the deliberations of immortal rulers. For brief, precious periods, they were simply brother and sister, children whose extraordinary nature was merely potential rather than active burden. But even in these moments of relative peace, careful observers might have noticed signs of the greatness and tragedy that lay ahead. Miquella's games often involved healing injured animals or coaxing flowers to bloom out of season, his natural compassion already manifesting in small miracles that spoke of divine power barely contained within mortal form. Millennia's play frequently took the form of mock battles where she insisted on protecting her brother from imaginary enemies, her warrior's instincts emerging even before she fully understood what she would be called upon to defend him against. The curse that bound Miquella to eternal youth was not merely physical but spiritual, ensuring that no matter how much knowledge he gained or how deep his understanding became, some part of him would always retain the clarity and wonder of a child encountering the world for the first time. This quality would prove to be both his greatest strength and his most vulnerable point, allowing him to imagine possibilities that escaped more jaded minds while simultaneously leaving him unprepared for the depths of cruelty and corruption that mature evil could achieve. As the twins began to mature in the ways that their afflictions allowed, their relationship to each other and to the world around them grew increasingly complex. They were simultaneously innocent children and beings of tremendous power, loving siblings, and potential rivals for cosmic authority, symbols of hope, and embodiments of divine tragedy. The weight of these contradictions would shape every aspect of their development, ensuring that even their most private moments were touched by the shadow of their extraordinary destiny. The lands between watched the growth of these remarkable children with a mixture of wonder, fear, and anticipation, sensing that their presence heralded changes that would touch every corner of existence. Some saw in them the promise of a new golden age, a time when divine wisdom would be tempered by genuine compassion and the harsh realities of rule would be softened by the perspective of those who understood suffering intimately. Others feared that their very existence represented a threat to the established order, a challenge to the careful balance of forces that had maintained stability for so long. But perhaps most significantly, the twins themselves began to understand that their love for each other was not merely personal but cosmic in its implications, a bond that would be tested by forces that sought to use their affection as a weapon against them and their enemies alike. They learned that to love a god, or to be loved by one, was to accept that such love would inevitably become entangled with questions of power, destiny, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. In the quiet moments between the great events that would define their legend, Miquella and Millennia held fast to their bond, drawing strength from the certainty that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. Their love became both refuge and fortress, both the source of their greatest vulnerability and the wellspring of their most extraordinary power, a connection that would endure through transformations that would challenge every assumption about the nature of identity, loyalty, and the price of divine ambition. In the years that followed Miquella's emergence into divine consciousness, as his understanding of both his own nature and the world around him deepened through study and contemplation, there came a time when the young Empyrean began to wrestle with the fundamental question that would define the remainder of his existence. For all his nascent wisdom and boundless compassion, for all the theoretical knowledge he had accumulated through his studies of Golden Order fundamentalism, he found himself confronted by a reality that no amount of scholarly learning could prepare him to face. The slow, inexorable deterioration of his beloved sister Millennia. The scarlet rot that consumed Millennia was not merely a disease in any conventional sense, not something that could be understood through normal medical knowledge or treated through traditional healing arts. It was the manifestation of divine will made flesh, the physical expression of an outer god, whose very nature was antithetical to everything the Golden Order claimed to represent. This corruption worked its way through Millennia's body with the patience of geological time and the certainty of mathematical law, claiming first her extremities, then her sight, then gradually working its way toward her vital organs with a methodical thoroughness that spoke of intelligence behind the affliction. Watching his sister's gradual transformation was perhaps the cruelest education that Miquella's eternal youth could provide. Each day brought new evidence of the rot's progress, new limitations imposed upon someone who had once moved through the world with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a master craftsman. Millennia bore her suffering with a dignity that humbled even those who witnessed it from a distance, never complaining of her pain or lamenting the future that was being stolen from her piece by piece. But Miquella saw through her brave facade to the anguish beneath. The fundamentalist teachings that had initially captured Miquella's brilliant mind spoke eloquently of cosmic order and divine law, of the perfect balance that governed all existence, and the wisdom that lay behind even apparent suffering. According to these doctrines, everything that occurred in the world was part of a greater design, each tragedy serving a purpose that might not be immediately apparent, but would eventually reveal itself as necessary for the maintenance of universal harmony. Pain and loss were not meaningless cruelties, but teaching tools employed by a cosmos that cared more about ultimate truth than temporary comfort. Yet when Miquella applied these teachings to Millennia's condition, when he tried to find the divine purpose behind his sister's slow destruction, the fundamentalist framework proved not merely inadequate, but actively offensive to his developing sense of justice and compassion. What possible cosmic purpose could be served by the systematic torture of someone who had never harmed another soul? What great truth could emerge from the gradual blinding and crippling of a being whose only crime was being born into circumstances beyond her control? The more deeply Miquella studied the fundamentalist texts, the more clearly he began to see the limitations and contradictions that lay at the heart of their supposedly perfect system of thought. The Golden Order that these teachings proclaimed as eternal and immutable had been built upon a foundation of exclusion and violence, its apparent perfection achieved through the systematic elimination of everything that did not conform to its narrow vision of proper existence. Those who live in death were hunted and destroyed, not because they posed any genuine threat to the living, but because their very existence challenged the Order's claim to have conquered mortality itself. This realization struck Miquella with the force of divine revelation, shattering the intellectual framework through which he had understood the world, and leaving him adrift in a cosmos that suddenly seemed far more complex and morally ambiguous than he had ever imagined. If the Golden Order's approach to those who live in death was fundamentally unjust, if its treatment of anything that deviated from its prescribed norms was based more on fear than wisdom, then what did that say about the system as a whole? What did it mean for his own position as a potential heir to this tradition? The weapons he had crafted in accordance with fundamentalist principles, the golden epitaph sword that bore the Haligtree sigil and possessed the power to permanently destroy those who live in death, suddenly seemed less like expressions of divine justice and more like tools of systematic oppression. The spells he had created as gifts for his father Radagon, the discus of light and triple rings of light, that had earned him such praise for their perfect embodiment of fundamental principles, now felt like contributions to a philosophical system that prioritized cosmic abstraction over individual suffering. This crisis of faith was not merely intellectual but deeply personal, for it forced Miquella to confront the possibility that his own beloved father might be complicit in perpetuating a system of thought that legitimized indifference to suffering. Radagon had welcomed his son's fundamentalist creations with pride and pleasure, had reciprocated with teachings of his own that further embedded Miquella within the Golden Order's ideological framework. Had this been genuine intellectual exchange between father and son, or had it been a form of subtle indoctrination designed to ensure that the next generation of divine rulers would maintain the status quo regardless of its moral implications? The relationship between Miquella and Godwyn the Golden, his elder half-brother, whose death had precipitated the creation of those who live in death, added another layer of complexity to his evolving understanding. The statue found in Elphael that depicted a larger figure embracing the twin Empyreans bore the long, wavy hair characteristic of Godwyn, rather than the distinctive braided style of Marika or Radagon, suggesting a bond between the siblings that had been both genuine and significant. If Godwyn had indeed served as a protective older brother to Miquella and Malenia, if he had provided them with the kind of emotional support and guidance that their unusual circumstances required, then his death represented not merely a cosmic tragedy, but a deeply personal loss that would have left the twins more isolated and vulnerable than ever. The creation of the Golden Epitaph sword as a memorial to Godwyn's death spoke of genuine grief and love, emotions that transcended the political and theological implications of his transformation into the Prince of Death. Yet this personal connection to Godwyn made Miquella's fundamentalist period even more troubling in retrospect, for it suggested that his creation of weapons designed to destroy those who live in death might have been motivated not by pure theological conviction, but by a complex mixture of grief, anger, and misplaced loyalty. If he had truly loved Godwyn as the statue suggested, then perhaps his persecution of the undead represented an attempt to honor his brother's memory by eliminating the corrupted remnants of his physical form, a tragic misunderstanding of what would actually serve Godwyn's spirit. The realization that love itself could be twisted into a justification for cruelty was perhaps the most painful lesson of Miquella's intellectual awakening. He had acted from the purest of motives, seeking to honor a beloved brother's memory and uphold what he had been taught were cosmic truths, yet his actions had contributed to the systematic oppression of beings whose only crime was existing in a form that the Golden Order found aesthetically or philosophically displeasing. This recognition of his own capacity for well-intentioned evil forced Miquella to examine not only his past actions but his fundamental approach to moral reasoning. If someone as compassionate and intellectually gifted as himself could be led astray by flawed teachings, if love and devotion could be channeled into destructive ends through the application of corrupt principles, then what hope was there for achieving genuine justice and healing in a world built upon such foundations? The answer, when it finally came to him through long nights of meditation and study, was both simple and revolutionary. If the existing system of thought was fundamentally flawed, then he would have to create a new one. If the Golden Order's approach to cosmic harmony was based upon exclusion and violence, then he would develop an alternative based upon inclusion and healing. If the fundamentalist framework proved inadequate for addressing the reality of suffering as embodied in his sister's condition, then he would forge new tools that could accomplish what the old ones could not. This decision represented far more than a mere intellectual pivot or a change in academic focus. It was nothing less than a declaration of independence from the entire tradition that had shaped his early development, a rejection of the assumption that wisdom necessarily flowed from established authority to emergent consciousness. Miquella was choosing to trust his own moral intuitions over the accumulated teachings of centuries, to privilege his direct experience of love and suffering over abstract principles that seemed to justify indifference to individual pain. The path forward that revealed itself to his awakening consciousness was both elegant and audacious in its simplicity. If the Golden Order represented an alloyed approach to cosmic harmony, a system that achieved its apparent strength by incorporating and subordinating various foreign elements, then perhaps what was needed was something purely opposite, an unalloyed approach that derived its power not from the accumulation of diverse influences, but from the absolute purity of a single, unwavering principle. The metaphor of metalworking that suggested itself to Miquella's mind was more than merely poetic. It reflected a deep understanding of the relationship between purity and power that would guide his subsequent development. An alloyed metal might indeed be stronger than its component parts in many practical applications, more resistant to corrosion, or better suited to specific uses. But it achieved this strength at the cost of purity, its essential nature diluted by the foreign substances that had been introduced into its structure. The Golden Order, viewed through this metallurgical lens, revealed itself as precisely such an alloy, its apparent strength achieved through the incorporation of diverse traditions, philosophies, and power structures that had been melted down and reformed into a new composite whole. The ancient dragons had been won over and integrated into Leindel's forces, their proud tradition of sovereignty subordinated to Marika's imperial ambitions. The Crucible Knights who had once served Godfrey brought their primal connection to the fundamental forces of life into service of the Erd Tree's more refined and abstract spirituality. Even the marriage between the houses of the Erd Tree and the Moon, the political alliance between Radagon and Renala that had briefly united the Golden Order with the Academy of Raya Lucaria, represented this same pattern of incorporation and subordination. As the Turtle Pope Miriel had observed with his characteristic wisdom, all things could indeed be conjoined under the Golden Order, but this conjunction always occurred on the Order's terms, with foreign elements being transformed to serve its purposes rather than being allowed to maintain their own essential character. Miquella's vision of unalloyed gold stood in stark contrast to this pattern of aggressive incorporation, where the Golden Order sought strength through diversity carefully controlled and channeled toward unified ends. Unalloyed gold would derive its power from the absolute purity of its essential nature, from its refusal to compromise or dilute its fundamental principles in pursuit of practical advantages. This was not merely a different approach to cosmic harmony, but a fundamentally different understanding of what harmony itself might mean. The physical manifestation of this philosophical breakthrough took the form of actual unalloyed gold, a material that Miquella learned to create through processes that combined metallurgical skill with divine insight. This was not merely symbolic gold or metaphorical purity, but an actual substance that could be worked and shaped, incorporated into weapons and armor, formed into needles that could pierce the flesh of the afflicted and provide genuine relief from suffering that had previously been considered incurable. The unalloyed gold water lily that became beloved by Miquella represented more than botanical curiosity. It embodied the principle that purity and beauty could coexist, that refusing to compromise one's essential nature did not require abandoning aesthetic pleasure or the simple joys that made existence worthwhile. These lilies bloomed in environments that would have killed ordinary flowers, their unalloyed nature allowing them to thrive in conditions that demanded absolute authenticity rather than adaptive flexibility. The bewitching branches that Miquella learnt to create, blessed with incantations of unalloyed gold, and possessed of the power to temporarily turn enemies into allies, demonstrated that purity of purpose need not manifest as rigid inflexibility. His unalloyed approach to cosmic harmony was sophisticated enough to recognize that even former enemies might be reached through demonstration of genuine compassion, that the boundaries between friend and foe were often more fluid than political expedience suggested. Most significantly, the armor and weapons that Miquella crafted for his beloved sister represented the practical application of his philosophical breakthrough to the problem that had motivated his entire intellectual journey. If traditional fundamentalist approaches could not address Millennia's affliction, if the Golden Order's healing arts were powerless against the influence of an outer god, then perhaps unalloyed gold could succeed where alloyed approaches had failed. The process of creating Millennia's armor was both technical achievement and act of love, requiring Miquella to pour not only his newfound understanding of pure materials, but his absolute devotion to his sister's welfare into every piece of metal he shaped and every protective ward he inscribed. This was not merely functional equipment designed to provide battlefield protection, but a tangible expression of the bond between the twins, a physical manifestation of the promise that Miquella had made to find some way to ease his sister's suffering. The theoretical foundation underlying unalloyed gold's power to resist the influence of outer gods lay in its perfect purity, its refusal to provide any point of entry or contamination through which alien influences might establish their hold. Where alloyed materials contained weaknesses and inconsistencies that could be exploited by sufficiently powerful external forces, unalloyed substances presented a uniform resistance that could not be overcome through the targeted application of corruption. The mirror helms worn by figures like Iji represented a similar principle applied through different means, their reflective surfaces turning the influence of outer gods back upon itself rather than absorbing and channeling such forces. Both approaches recognized that the greatest threat posed by these cosmic entities lay not in their raw power, but in their ability to find purchase within existing structures, to work their way into the cracks and inconsistencies that characterized most attempts at resistance. Miquella's needles of unalloyed gold represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of these principles, their design allowing them to be inserted directly into the corrupted flesh of those afflicted by divine influence, while providing a conduit for pure resistance that could gradually drive out the invading force. The creation of these needles required not only technical mastery of metallurgy and divine insight into the nature of corruption, but a deep understanding of the relationship between physical and spiritual healing. The process of crafting a needle that could address Millennia's specific affliction demanded that Miquella learn to perceive the exact nature of the Scarlet Rot's influence, to understand how the outer god of rot had established its hold within his sister's body, and what kind of intervention might be capable of disrupting that connection. This was detective work as much as it was engineering, requiring him to become an expert in forms of divine corruption that he had previously encountered only through theoretical study. When Miquella finally completed his first functional needle and witnessed its effect upon Millennia's condition, the validation of his theoretical breakthrough was both intellectually satisfying and emotionally overwhelming. The sight of his sister's pain being reduced, even temporarily, by something he had created with his own hands, represented proof that love properly directed and supported by adequate understanding could indeed accomplish what had previously seemed impossible. Yet the needle's effectiveness came with sobering limitations that reminded Miquella of the magnitude of the challenge he had chosen to address. The relief it provided was genuine but temporary, requiring periodic reapplication as the outer god's influence gradually reasserted itself. The process of insertion was itself painful, adding to Millennia's suffering even as it promised eventual relief. Most significantly, the needle could slow and reverse the rot's progress, but could not eliminate the underlying connection between Millennia and the divine force that had claimed her as its vessel. These limitations did not discourage Miquella, but rather inspired him to deeper study and more ambitious experimentation. If one needle could provide temporary relief, perhaps a more sophisticated version could offer permanent healing. If the current design could slow the rot's progress, perhaps future iterations could eliminate it entirely. The key was to continue refining his understanding of unalloyed principles while simultaneously developing more advanced applications of that knowledge. The broken needle that would eventually be found by the player character in the heart of Aeonia's Scarlet Swamp told a story of both triumph and tragedy, its shattered form bearing witness to the ultimate insufficiency of even Miquella's most sophisticated creations when confronted with the full fury of divine corruption unleashed. Yet its very existence, and the fact that it could be repaired and put to use in treating other victims of similar afflictions, demonstrated that Miquella's approach had been fundamentally sound, even if his initial execution had proved inadequate to the full scope of the challenge. The golden needle that could be given to Millicent represented a more mature version of Miquella's original design, its creation informed by hard-won experience of the limitations and possibilities inherent in treating divine corruption through the application of pure resistance. This needle could indeed forestall the rotting sickness, could remove pain and nightmares from those who had been touched by forces beyond mortal understanding, proving that compassion properly informed by wisdom could achieve results that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed them. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Miquella's needles was their versatility, their ability to address not only the specific corruption of the scarlet rot, but other forms of divine influence as well. The final version that could be used to subdue the outer god of the frenzied flame demonstrated that unalloyed principles possessed a universality that transcended the particular circumstances of their initial development, that purity properly understood could serve as a defense against any form of external spiritual corruption. This discovery opened vast new possibilities for Miquella's work, suggesting that his approach might have applications far beyond his sister's immediate needs. If unalloyed gold could resist the influence of multiple outer gods, if its principles could be adapted to address various forms of divine corruption, then perhaps it represented not merely a solution to a personal problem, but the foundation for a new approach to cosmic harmony that could benefit all conscious beings. The recognition that his work had implications extending far beyond his family circle marked another crucial development in Miquella's intellectual and spiritual evolution. What had begun as a desperate attempt to help his beloved sister was revealing itself as potentially the key to addressing some of the fundamental problems that plagued existence in the lands between. The same forces that threatened millennia also menaced countless other beings. The same patterns of divine corruption and spiritual contamination that had claimed her as a vessel were actively seeking other targets throughout the world. Miquella's developing mastery of unalloyed principles positioned him uniquely to serve as a healer and protector for all those who found themselves caught between cosmic forces beyond their control and comprehension. His eternal youth, which had initially seemed like a cruel limitation upon his development, was beginning to reveal itself as precisely the quality that would allow him to maintain the kind of pure compassion and unwavering dedication necessary for such work. The contrast between Miquella's unalloyed approach and the Golden Order's alloyed methodology became increasingly stark as his understanding deepened and his practical skills developed. Where the Order sought to control and channel potentially dangerous forces, incorporating them into its own structure while attempting to limit their more destructive tendencies, Miquella's way offered the possibility of genuine resistance and ultimate liberation from such influences entirely. Yet this fundamental difference in approach carried with it equally fundamental differences in the kinds of political and social structures that would be necessary to support each methodology. The Golden Order's success depended upon maintaining centralized control over diverse populations and territories, ensuring that all incorporation of foreign elements occurred according to carefully established protocols designed to preserve the system's essential character. Miquella's vision, by contrast, seemed to point toward a more decentralized model based upon individual liberation and voluntary cooperation, rather than hierarchical control and systematic subordination. The implications of this difference would become increasingly important as Miquella's work attracted the attention of those who had been failed by existing systems, those who found themselves excluded from the Golden Order's vision of cosmic harmony, and were therefore seeking alternatives that might offer them hope for genuine acceptance and healing. The stage was being set for a conflict that would transcend mere personal or familial concerns and become a struggle over the fundamental principles that would govern the future development of consciousness in the lands between. The decision to abandon the fundamentalist principles that had shaped his early intellectual development and embrace, instead, the revolutionary concept of unalloyed gold marked a fundamental transformation in Miquella's understanding of his own purpose and destiny. Yet the true test of any philosophical breakthrough lies not in its theoretical elegance, but in its practical application. And Miquella soon discovered that translating his insights about purity and resistance into tangible improvements in his sister's condition would require him to undertake projects of unprecedented ambition and complexity. The Haligtree began not as a grand architectural statement or a challenge to the Erdtree's dominance, but as something far more intimate and personal, a desperate experiment born from love and watered with the most precious substance Miquella possessed to offer. For if his theories about unalloyed gold were correct, if purity of essence could indeed resist the corrupting influence of outer gods, then perhaps the same principles might be applied on a scale vast enough to create an entire environment where such corruption could not take hold. The planting of the Haligtree required Miquella to make a sacrifice that would have been unthinkable to him in his earlier, more theoretical phase of development. The young Empyrean opened his own veins and allowed his divine blood to flow into the earth where the sacred sapling had been placed, understanding instinctively that only the most profound personal commitment could provide the foundation for such an ambitious undertaking. This was not merely symbolic gesture, but practical necessity. For the tree that was to grow from this consecrated ground would need to be nourished by essence that was itself unalloyed, untainted by any compromise or dilution. The process of nurturing the Haligtree through its early stages of growth demanded from Miquella a level of sustained dedication that tested every aspect of his character and capabilities. Each day brought new challenges as the young tree struggled to establish itself in soil that had been shaped by centuries of Golden Order influence, its pure nature constantly threatened by environmental forces that sought to corrupt or co-opt its development according to more familiar patterns. Miquella learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his tree's health and progress, developing an almost mystical connection to the plant that allowed him to sense its needs and respond to its distress with immediate and appropriate intervention. When the Haligtree's leaves began to show signs of spiritual contamination from ambient Golden Order influences, he would spend hours in meditation beside its trunk, channeling his own unalloyed essence into its root system until the symptoms subsided. When its growth seemed to slow or falter, he would offer more of his blood, pouring his life force into the project with a dedication that bordered on obsession. The years required for the Haligtree to develop from vulnerable sapling into something approaching a mature tree tested not only Miquella's physical endurance, but his faith in his own theoretical framework. There were periods when the tree seemed to make no progress at all, when months of careful nurturing produced no visible results, when the sheer magnitude of the task he had undertaken threatened to overwhelm his determination and resolve. During these dark times, Miquella was forced to confront the possibility that his understanding of unalloyed principles might be fundamentally flawed, that his rejection of Golden Order fundamentalism might have led him down a path that would ultimately prove fruitless. Yet each time despair threatened to claim him, Miquella would return to the bedside of his suffering sister and find there the renewed motivation necessary to continue his work. Millennia's courage in the face of her own progressive deterioration, her unwavering faith in her brother's vision, despite the evident limitations of his early attempts at healing, served as a constant reminder of why the Haligtree project was not merely intellectually interesting, but morally imperative. If there was even the slightest chance that creating an environment of perfect purity might provide relief for her condition, then no amount of personal sacrifice could be considered excessive. As the Haligtree gradually matured and its true nature became more apparent, Miquella began to understand that what he was creating was far more than simply an alternative to the Erd tree or a monument to his own philosophical insights. The great tree that rose from the earth, nourished by his blood, was becoming a beacon of hope for all those who had been failed by existing systems, a sanctuary where beings could find refuge from the corrupting influences that plagued the broader world. The resemblance between the Haligtree and the Erd tree was both undeniable and profoundly misleading. For while the two trees shared certain superficial characteristics, their fundamental purposes and underlying principles could not have been more different. Where the Erd tree served as the visible symbol of Golden Order authority and the physical anchor for a system of cosmic control that extended into every aspect of existence, the Haligtree offered something far more radical: the possibility of genuine liberation from all external systems of spiritual and political domination. The Erd tree avatars that emerged from the Haligtree as it matured bore witness to the deep structural similarities between Miquella's creation and the great tree that dominated Leyndell, yet their behavior revealed crucial differences in purpose and intention. These guardians existed not to enforce conformity to established doctrine, but to protect the diversity of life that had found refuge within the Haligtree's sphere of influence. They welcomed rather than excluded, healed rather than punished, embodied the principle that all conscious beings deserved protection regardless of their ability to conform to predetermined standards of acceptability. The armor worn by the Haligtree Knights reflected both the tree's ultimate failure to achieve its full potential and the nobility of the vision that had inspired its creation. These warriors understood that their lord's great project had not succeeded in growing into a true rival to the Erd tree, that the forces arrayed against such transformation had proven too powerful for even Miquella's genius and dedication to overcome completely. Yet they served with no less devotion for knowing that their cause was likely doomed, their loyalty based not on expectation of victory, but on recognition that some ideals were worth defending, regardless of their practical prospects for success. The question of when exactly the Haligtree had been planted carried implications that extended far beyond mere historical curiosity, for the answer would reveal much about Miquella's motivations and his understanding of his own relationship to the established order. If the tree had been planted before the shattering of the Elden Ring, during the period of apparent Golden Order stability and prosperity, then its creation represented a direct challenge to Marika's authority, a declaration that even the most successful existing system was fundamentally inadequate and required replacement. The alternative possibility that the Haligtree had been planted after the shattering using one of the golden seeds that were scattered across the lands between when the Elden Ring was broken suggested a more reactive approach to social transformation. In this scenario, Miquella would have been responding to the collapse of existing order, rather than proactively working to undermine it. His tree, representing an attempt to salvage something beautiful from the wreckage of a failed system rather than a revolutionary challenge to successful tyranny. The presence of the Haligtree sigil on the golden epitaph sword, a weapon that had been created to commemorate Godwin's death, and therefore must have existed before the shattering, provided strong evidence that the tree itself had been established during the earlier period. This suggested that Miquella's break with Golden Order fundamentalism had been both earlier and more decisive than might otherwise have been supposed. His commitment to creating alternatives rather than reform existing structures dating back to his initial recognition of the system's moral inadequacies. The decision to plant the Haligtree in the consecrated snowfield, one of the most remote and inhospitable regions of the lands between, reflected Miquella's understanding that his project would face opposition from established powers, and therefore required protection through isolation and concealment. Unlike the Erd tree, which dominated the landscape of central Hyrule and served as a constant reminder of Golden Order authority, the Haligtree was hidden away where only the most determined seekers could locate it, its very existence unknown to most of the world's inhabitants. This geographic isolation served multiple purposes beyond mere defensive considerations. It ensured that those who did make the journey to reach the Haligtree would be genuinely committed to its principles rather than casual tourists or opportunistic converts seeking to exploit its resources for personal gain. The difficulty of the journey served as a form of natural selection, filtering out those who lacked the dedication necessary to contribute meaningfully to the kind of community Miquella envisioned creating. The harsh environment of the snowfield also provided practical advantages for maintaining the tree's spiritual purity. Its isolation from centers of Golden Order influence reducing the constant pressure of ambient corruption that might otherwise have compromised Miquella's careful work. In this remote location, the Haligtree could develop according to its own internal logic rather than being forced to adapt to external expectations or conform to established patterns of growth and development. As the tree matured and began to attract its first refugees and pilgrims, Miquella discovered that creating a sanctuary required him to develop skills and knowledge far beyond his initial expertise in metallurgy and divine healing. He needed to become an administrator, capable of organizing complex communities, a diplomat, skilled in mediating between different groups with potentially conflicting needs and expectations, a military strategist able to defend his realm against external threats, and above all, a spiritual leader capable of inspiring others to maintain faith in ideals that often seemed impossibly remote from practical reality. The diversity of beings who found their way to the Haligtree both validated Miquella's inclusive vision and presented him with challenges he had never anticipated during his earlier, more theoretical period of development. The Albinorics who sought refuge there brought with them the trauma of systematic persecution and the practical needs of a people whose artificial nature made them poorly suited to environments designed for naturally evolved life. Their presence required Miquella to develop new forms of healing and support that could address not only physical ailments, but the deeper spiritual wounds inflicted by centuries of marginalization and abuse. The misbegotten who gathered beneath the Haligtree's protective canopy carried their own burden of rejection and violence, their hybrid nature making them outcasts in a world that demanded clear categories and simple identities. Their integration into the tree's community required Miquella to confront his own assumptions about normalcy and acceptance, challenging him to expand his understanding of what forms conscious life might legitimately take. The astray mages of Raya Lucaria, who found sanctuary among the Haligtree's branches, brought with them knowledge and capabilities that could strengthen the community's defensive capabilities, while also introducing potential complications through their association with systems of power that had proven corruptible. Their presence raised difficult questions about how much contact with existing institutions the Haligtree community could maintain without compromising its essential purity. Perhaps most significantly, the presence of Loretta, the knight who had deemed the Haligtree a suitable haven for the persecuted Albinaurics, provided Miquella with both a powerful military ally and a living example of how individuals shaped by existing systems could nevertheless transcend their origins and commit themselves to radically different principles. Loretta's transformation from Golden Order Knight to Protector of Outcasts demonstrated that redemption and conversion were possible even for those who had been deeply embedded within structures of oppression. The Crystalians who found refuge within the Haligtree's sphere of influence represented perhaps the most alien form of consciousness that Miquella had yet encountered. Their crystalline nature, challenging basic assumptions about what constituted life and intelligence. Their integration into the community required him to develop new forms of communication and cooperation that could bridge gaps between radically different modes of existence, expanding his understanding of what genuine inclusivity might require. The development of Elphael, the city that grew up within the protective brace that supported the Haligtree itself, represented Miquella's most ambitious attempt to create a practical alternative to existing forms of social organization. Unlike the hierarchical structures that characterized most settlements in the lands between, Elphael was designed around principles of mutual aid and voluntary cooperation, its architecture reflecting an understanding that true community could not be imposed from above, but must emerge from the willing participation of its members. The statues that filled Elphael told the story of the community's founding and development through visual narratives that emphasized themes of protection, sacrifice, and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The recurring image of Miquella cradling a young sapling spoke to the deeply personal nature of his commitment to the project, while the depictions of the twins together reminded viewers that individual achievement was meaningless without the bonds of love and mutual support that made such achievement possible. The larger statue, depicting a figure with long, wavy hair embracing both twins, provided a connection to their shared past and the relationships that had shaped their development before their divergent paths had led them to their current circumstances. If this figure did indeed represent Godwyn the Golden, as seemed most likely given the sculptural details and historical context, then its prominent placement within Elphael suggested that Miquella had found ways to honor his lost brother's memory that transcended the violent fundamentalism of his earlier period. The more numerous statues showing the twins alone together, supporting each other through their respective afflictions and limitations, captured something essential about the emotional foundation upon which the entire Haligtree project had been built. These images reminded viewers that all of Miquella's grand ambitions and theoretical innovations ultimately derived from the simple desire to ease his sister's suffering. That cosmic transformation could begin with the most intimate and personal forms of love. The guards who stood watch over Elphael embodied both the community's commitment to protecting its members and the deep sadness that permeated life in a sanctuary that existed only because the broader world had proven hostile to those who sought refuge there. Their dejected postures and outward-gazing attention reflected the constant awareness that their peaceful existence depended upon maintaining vigilance against external threats that could never be entirely eliminated. The discovery that the sacred light within these guardians would explode upon their deaths, potentially causing harm to those they had dedicated their lives to protecting, added another layer of tragedy to their service. Yet, even this terrible revelation did not shake their dedication, their spirit ashes revealing a faith so profound that they welcomed the possibility of using their own deaths as beacons to guide their Lord's eventual return. The withering of Miquella's lilies, and St. Trina's lilies throughout Elphael provided constant reminders that the Haligtree's apparent success in creating a sanctuary was fundamentally dependent upon its creator's continued presence and active nurturing. Without Miquella's direct involvement, the systems he had established to maintain spiritual purity began to break down, allowing corruption and decay to seep into spaces that had once been perfectly protected. The presence of those afflicted with scarlet rot in the later stages of the Haligtree's existence revealed the ultimate limitation of even Miquella's most sophisticated attempts at creating perfect sanctuary. The rot that consumed his sister had found ways to penetrate even the most carefully maintained barriers, demonstrating that some forms of corruption were too fundamental and pervasive to be excluded through any purely defensive approach. Yet the fact that these afflicted individuals had found their way to the Haligtree, that they continued to seek refuge there even after it had begun to fail, testified to the enduring power of the hope that Miquella had created. Even a failed sanctuary could serve as a beacon for those who had nowhere else to turn. Even a withering tree could provide more comfort and acceptance than the alternatives available in the broader world. The bewitching branches that could be crafted from Miquella's lilies, blessed with incantations of unalloyed gold and possessed of the power to temporarily inspire affection in former enemies, revealed another dimension of his approach to creating change in the world. Where the Golden Order typically sought to control opposition through force or eliminate it entirely, Miquella's methods suggested the possibility of transformation through demonstration of genuine care and concern. The description of these branches as evidence that Miquella had learned to compel affection spoke to abilities that went beyond normal charisma or political skill, suggesting a form of influence that operated on spiritual rather than merely psychological levels. Yet the temporary nature of this effect indicated that Miquella understood the difference between genuine conversion and magical compulsion, his approach designed to provide opportunities for authentic change, rather than to create permanent puppets incapable of independent thought. The secret nature of the Haligtree, accessible only to those who possessed both halves of the special medallion that could unlock the hidden path through the grand lift of Rold, reflected Miquella's understanding that his project required protection not only from direct military assault, but from the more subtle corrupting influences that might be introduced by those whose motives were insufficiently pure. The difficulty of reaching the tree served as both practical security measure and spiritual test, ensuring that only the most committed seekers could gain access to its secrets. The fact that this medallion bore the alternative name of Miquella's favor suggested that access to the Haligtree was understood not as a right to be claimed, but as a gift to be earned through demonstration of worthiness. The favor of a demigod was not something that could be demanded or purchased, but only granted to those who had proven themselves capable of understanding and respecting the principles upon which the sanctuary had been founded. The network of supporters and allies that Miquella cultivated in locations far from the Haligtree itself, including the residents of Castle Sol and various other communities that provided assistance to those seeking to make the pilgrimage to his sanctuary, demonstrated his understanding that creating lasting change required building coalitions and alliances that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single community or institution. These relationships also revealed Miquella's sophisticated grasp of political strategy, his recognition that even the most idealistic projects required practical support and material resources that could only be obtained through careful cultivation of mutually beneficial arrangements with groups whose interests might not align perfectly with his own ultimate goals, but who could nevertheless be persuaded to provide limited cooperation. As the Haligtree grew toward its full potential, its success began to attract attention from forces that viewed its existence as either opportunity or threat, setting the stage for conflicts that would test every aspect of Miquella's vision and ultimately lead to developments that even his remarkable foresight had failed to anticipate. The sanctuary he had created through such tremendous personal sacrifice was about to become the prize in struggles that would determine not only its own fate, but the future direction of consciousness in the lands between. The approaching crisis would reveal whether Miquella's commitment to inclusive principles and non-violent transformation could withstand the pressures that would inevitably be brought to bear against them, whether his faith in the ultimate triumph of love over corruption was justified, or merely the beautiful delusion of someone whose eternal youth had left him unprepared for the harsh realities of power and politics in a world shaped by gods, whose own perfection was far from complete. In the chambers of consciousness that exist beyond the boundaries of waking thought, where the mind travels when released from the constraints of physical sensation and worldly concern, there dwelt another aspect of Miquella's divine nature that was both intimately connected to his daylight self and mysteriously separate from it. This presence, known throughout the lands between by the name Saint Trina, embodied qualities and possessed abilities that complemented and completed the work that Miquella pursued in his more familiar form, yet did so through methods so different that many who encountered both aspects refused to believe they could possibly share the same essential identity. The relationship between Miquella and Saint Trina was far more complex than simple alternation between different personas or the adoption of various roles to suit different circumstances. This was not merely a matter of the young Empyrean choosing to present himself differently to different audiences, though elements of conscious choice certainly played a role in how these dual aspects of his nature manifested and interacted with the world around them. Rather, what existed between Miquella and Saint Trina was something approaching the metaphysical relationship that bound Queen Marika to Radagon, a fundamental duality that existed at the very core of divine consciousness, and expressed itself through apparently separate identities that were nevertheless unified at levels deeper than ordinary perception could grasp. Yet where the relationship between Marika and Radagon was characterized by conflict and contradiction, with each aspect of their shared nature frequently working at cross purposes to the goals and desires of the other, the connection between Miquella and Saint Trina seemed to flow from a deeper harmony of purpose and intention. Both aspects of his nature were dedicated to the same fundamental goal of healing and compassion, though they pursued this objective through radically different means and in radically different realms of existence. Miquella's work took place primarily in the physical world. His efforts focused on creating tangible solutions to material problems through the application of scientific principles and divine power to the challenges posed by corruption, disease, and political oppression. His needles of unalloyed gold, his sanctuary of the halig tree, his various experiments in alternative forms of social organization, all represented attempts to transform the actual conditions of existence in ways that would reduce suffering and increase the possibilities for genuine flourishing among conscious beings. Saint Trina's approach, by contrast, operated entirely within the realm of consciousness itself, working to provide relief and healing through the mysterious processes that govern sleep, dream, and the various altered states of awareness that existed at the margins of ordinary waking experience. Where Miquella sought to change the external world, to make it more compatible with the needs of suffering beings, Saint Trina offered ways for those beings to temporarily escape the world's limitations and find refuge in inner spaces that were not subject to the same constraints and corruptions that plagued material existence. The Trina's lily that bore such striking resemblance to Miquella's own lily of unalloyed gold provided the most obvious evidence of the connection between these two aspects of divine nature, their similar appearance suggesting shared origins, while their different properties and applications revealed the complementary nature of their respective purposes. Where Miquella's lily served as the foundation for creating physical remedies and protective devices, Trina's lily offered the raw materials for crafting substances that could induce the kind of profound rest and inner peace that made healing possible at levels deeper than mere physical repair. The sleep that Saint Trina could provide was not the ordinary unconsciousness that claimed most beings at the end of each day's activities, that simple cessation of awareness that allowed the body to recover from fatigue and the mind to process the experiences accumulated during waking hours. This was something far more profound and therapeutic, a state of consciousness that combined the restorative qualities of natural sleep with the transformative potential of mystical experience, offering those who received it the opportunity to encounter aspects of their own nature and potential that remained hidden during ordinary states of awareness. The arrows and other implements crafted from Trina's lilies carried within them the power to induce this sacred sleep in others, their effectiveness suggesting that Saint Trina's abilities extended far beyond simple pharmaceutical knowledge or even divine magic, into realms that touched the fundamental structures of consciousness itself. The description of this sleep as potentially habit-forming spoke not to any addictive properties in the conventional sense, but to the profound sense of relief and renewal that those who experienced it could discover, the natural desire to return again and again to a state of being where suffering could be temporarily suspended and inner healing could occur. The priests who served Saint Trina and used these arrows as part of their ritual practices represented one of the few organized religious movements in the lands. Between that was dedicated primarily to healing rather than to the accumulation or exercise of power. Their work took place largely in the shadows and margins of society, ministering to those who had been failed by more conventional forms of spiritual guidance, and offering comfort to those whose suffering was too deep or too complex to be addressed through ordinary means. The rituals these priests performed, though their specific details remained shrouded in mystery and speculation, seemed to involve guiding participants into carefully controlled experiences of sacred sleep, where various forms of inner work could be accomplished. These might include the processing of traumatic memories, the exploration of suppressed aspects of personality and potential, the cultivation of inner resources for dealing with external challenges, or simply the provision of profound rest for souls that had been driven to exhaustion by the harsh demands of existence in a world shaped by conflict and corruption. The suggestion that Saint Trina could actually be encountered within the realm of sleep, that those who achieved sufficiently deep states of sacred unconsciousness might find themselves in the presence of this mysterious figure, opened possibilities for direct spiritual communion that transcended the normal boundaries between teacher and student, healer and patient, divine and mortal. If such encounters were indeed possible, they would represent opportunities for forms of instruction and healing that could not be replicated through any external means, experiences that could transform those who received them in ways that ordinary teaching or conventional therapy could never achieve. The physical representations of Saint Trina found on various artifacts and implements provided tantalizing glimpses into the visual nature of this aspect of Miquella's consciousness, though the apparent contradictions between these images and Miquella's eternally youthful appearance raised profound questions about the relationship between physical form and spiritual identity in beings of divine nature. The feminine features depicted on Saint Trina's torch and the adult appearance suggested by various artistic representations seemed to indicate that in the realm of sleep and dream, the constraints that bound Miquella's physical form in the waking world might not apply. This possibility that Saint Trina represented not merely an alternative persona, but an alternative form of embodiment for Miquella's consciousness, suggested that the curse of eternal youth that bound his physical form might be transcended in other states of existence. If this were indeed the case, then the realm of sleep might offer Miquella himself a form of liberation from the limitations that constrained his development in the material world, providing him with access to aspects of his own nature and potential that remained locked away during ordinary states of consciousness. The feminine aspect of Saint Trina's appearance added another layer of complexity to this already intricate relationship, suggesting that the duality between Miquella and his sleep realm counterpart might involve not only differences in method and focus, but fundamental questions of identity and gender that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of divine consciousness. If Saint Trina was indeed a feminine expression of the same essential being that manifested as the eternally youthful Miquella, then their relationship might represent a form of spiritual completeness that transcended ordinary categories of identity and self-understanding. The carved features on Saint Trina's torch, described as unnerving by those who encountered them, suggested that this feminine aspect of Miquella's nature possessed qualities that were both beautiful and somehow unsettling, characteristics that might reflect the profound transformative power that sleep and dream could wield over consciousness. The ability to enter into other beings' dreams and inner experiences, to guide their unconscious processes, and facilitate forms of healing that operated below the threshold of ordinary awareness, necessarily involved wielding influence of a kind that could be either tremendously beneficial or deeply invasive, depending upon the intentions and wisdom of the one who possessed such abilities. The question of whether Miquella maintained conscious control over Saint Trina's activities, or whether this aspect of his nature operated with a degree of independence, similar to the relationship between Marika and Radagon, carried significant implications for understanding both his character and the potential consequences of his various projects and commitments. If Saint Trina could act autonomously, pursuing her own agenda within the realm of sleep and dream, then Miquella's conscious plans and intentions might be supplemented or even sometimes contradicted by activities taking place beyond his direct awareness or control. The ancient cut content that revealed Saint Trina's involvement with the merchant communities of the lands between provided glimpses into a period when this aspect of Miquella's nature had been actively engaged in forms of healing and assistance that operated on a much broader scale than the more focused work associated with his later, more mature period of development. The crystal ball that had once been associated with Saint Trina spoke of teaching merchants songs that could provide relief from the influence of the frenzied flame, suggesting that her compassion extended even to those who had been touched by forces that most other beings considered utterly beyond redemption. The merchant's affliction with the frenzied flame represented one of the most tragic and seemingly hopeless forms of corruption that existed in the lands between, the influence of this particular outer god being so fundamentally destructive that it turned its vessels into instruments of apocalyptic destruction rather than mere corruption or decay. The fact that Saint Trina had once offered assistance to those suffering from such affliction demonstrated a level of compassion and therapeutic ambition that surpassed even the remarkable dedication that Miquella had shown in his efforts to address his sister's scarlet rot. The songs that Saint Trina had taught to these merchants, described as lullabies that could provide temporary relief from the burning madness of frenzied flame influence, represented a form of healing that operated through purely aesthetic and emotional means, rather than through the application of physical substances or magical procedures. This approach suggested that Saint Trina's understanding of therapeutic intervention was based upon recognition that consciousness itself possessed inherent healing properties that could be activated through the right combination of rhythm, melody, and spiritual resonance. The dream mist that could once be collected from sleeping enemies and sold to merchants for the purpose of quelling their flame-touched madness, provided evidence of a sophisticated system of mutual aid and therapeutic exchange that had once flourished under St. Trina's guidance. This network of healing relationships suggested that her work had at one time created a form of underground economy based upon compassion and mutual support rather than exploitation and accumulation, an alternative to the more familiar systems of trade and commerce that dominated most interactions between different groups and communities. The sudden cessation of St. Trina's activities, the mysterious disappearance that had left the merchants without access to the songs and guidance they had come to depend upon, marked a crucial turning point in Miquella's overall development and suggested that forces beyond his conscious control had begun to interfere with his work in ways that threatened not only his individual projects, but his fundamental capacity to maintain the dual nature that had allowed him to operate effectively in both waking and sleeping realms of existence. The connection between St. Trina's disappearance and Miquella's decision to embed himself within the Haligtree was almost certainly not coincidental, though the precise nature of the relationship between these two developments remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. It seemed likely that the same circumstances that had forced Miquella to retreat into his cocoon of transformation had also disrupted his ability to maintain his presence in the realm of sleep and dream, cutting off the merchants and other beneficiaries of St. Trina's work from a source of healing and support that had become essential to their continued survival and well-being. The possibility that St. Trina's disappearance had been voluntary, a conscious decision on Miquella's part to withdraw from activities that had become too dangerous or too demanding of his limited resources, seemed less likely than the alternative explanation that external forces had somehow disrupted his ability to maintain the complex balance of consciousness that allowed him to exist simultaneously as both waking healer and dream guide. If this interpretation were correct, then St. Trina's silence represented not abandonment but enforced separation, a form of spiritual violence that had torn apart an integrated approach to healing and transformation that had once offered hope to some of the most desperate and afflicted beings in the lands between. The lullabies associated with St. Trina's work, described in various sources as possessing the power to draw listeners down into sleep as irresistibly as quicksand or quagmire, suggested that her abilities operated through mechanisms that bypassed ordinary consciousness and worked directly upon the deeper structures of awareness that govern states of arousal, attention, and mental activity. This was not merely a matter of inducing physical relaxation or mental fatigue, but of creating conditions where the normal boundaries between waking and sleeping consciousness could be temporarily dissolved, allowing for forms of inner experience and transformation that were impossible during ordinary states of awareness. The purple haze associated with St. Trina's sleep-inducing substances provided a visual symbol of the liminal space between full consciousness and complete unconsciousness where her healing work took place, that twilight realm where the logical structures that governed waking thought could be temporarily suspended while deeper, more intuitive forms of understanding and processing could emerge. This intermediate state of awareness might have provided optimal conditions for the kind of inner healing and integration that could address forms of trauma and corruption that were too fundamental to be reached through more conventional therapeutic approaches. The comparison between St. Trina's sleep and both lullaby and quagmire captured something essential about the dual nature of the experiences she provided. Their capacity to offer both comfort and challenge, both rest and transformation. Like the most effective forms of genuine therapy, the sleep that St. Trina could induce was not merely pleasant escape from difficult realities, but active engagement with those realities at levels where meaningful change and healing could occur. even when such engagement involved confronting aspects of experience that had been too painful or too threatening to face during ordinary waking consciousness. The sweet dreams promised by the sleep-pot description suggested that St. Trina's approach to healing through altered states of consciousness was fundamentally different from the harsh confrontational methods that characterized many other forms of spiritual discipline and transformation in the lands between. Rather than forcing individuals to face their limitations and failures through external challenges and ordeals, her method worked through providing them with inner experiences of peace, beauty, and fulfillment that could serve as foundations for building healthier and more integrated forms of consciousness. This gentler approach to transformation and healing reflected the same fundamental compassion that motivated all of Miquella's work, though expressed through methods that recognized the particular vulnerabilities and needs of beings whose suffering had been so severe that conventional forms of assistance were insufficient or even counterproductive. For those who had been traumatized by violence, betrayed by trust, or broken by experiences that exceeded their capacity to understand or integrate, the promise of sweet dreams might represent the only form of relief and renewal that remained accessible. The mystery surrounding St. Trina's current status, the question of whether this aspect of Miquella's nature continued to exist in some form during his period of cocoon-bound transformation, or had been completely severed from his consciousness by the circumstances that had forced his withdrawal from active involvement in the world, carried implications that extended far beyond mere biographical curiosity. If St. Trina's influence and abilities had been permanently lost, then an entire approach to healing and transformation had disappeared from the world, leaving countless beings without access to forms of assistance that might have been essential to their survival and well-being. Yet the possibility remained that St. Trina's apparent disappearance was temporary rather than permanent, that the same process of metamorphosis that held Miquella suspended in his cocoon might also be affecting the relationship between his various aspects and identities in ways that could ultimately lead to new forms of integration and empowerment. If this were the case, then St. Trina's current absence might represent not loss but preparation, a gathering of resources and transformation of capabilities that would eventually allow for even more effective forms of healing and assistance than had been possible during the earlier period of her activity. The implications of St. Trina's work extended far beyond the direct benefits provided to those who received her healing and guidance, for her very existence demonstrated that approaches to consciousness and transformation that operated outside the framework of established religious and political institutions could nevertheless achieve remarkable results in addressing forms of suffering that those institutions had proven incapable of handling effectively. Her success in providing relief to beings afflicted with frenzied flame influence, a form of corruption that even the most sophisticated Golden Order healing arts could not address, proved that alternative methods and perspectives possessed validity and power that mainstream approaches lacked. This validation of alternative healing methodologies had potentially revolutionary implications for understanding the nature of consciousness itself and the possibilities for transformation that existed within it, suggesting that the established authorities and institutions that claimed exclusive access to effective spiritual and therapeutic knowledge were either mistaken about their own capabilities or deliberately withholding more effective approaches in order to maintain their positions of power and influence. The network of relationships and mutual support that had flourished during the period of St. Trina's active involvement with the merchant communities represented a form of social organization based upon principles radically different from those that governed most interactions in the lands between, demonstrating that economic exchange could be organized around healing and mutual aid. rather than exploitation and accumulation. The existence of this alternative economic model, even for a limited time and within a restricted population, proved that other forms of social organization were possible and might be more effective at promoting genuine well-being than the systems that currently dominated most communities. As the mystery of Saint Trina's identity and current status continued to perplex scholars and seekers throughout the lands between, her legacy served as a reminder that even divine beings possessed depths and complexities that exceeded easy understanding or categorization. The relationship between her work and Miquella's more familiar activities suggested that effective healing and transformation might require multiple approaches, operating simultaneously across different levels of experience and consciousness, that no single method or perspective, however sophisticated or well-intentioned, could address the full spectrum of challenges that faced conscious beings in a world shaped by forces beyond their individual control. The story of Saint Trina thus became both complement to and commentary upon Miquella's other activities, demonstrating the breadth of his compassion, while also revealing the limitations that constrained even his remarkable abilities and insights. Her disappearance marked not only a personal loss for those who had benefited from her guidance, but a diminishment of the world's capacity for healing and transformation. A reduction in the available approaches to addressing suffering that left all conscious beings somewhat more vulnerable to forces that sought their corruption or destruction. Yet, even in her absence, the memory of Saint Trina's work continued to inspire hope that alternative approaches to healing and consciousness remained possible, that the apparent victory of established powers and conventional methods might not represent the final word on what could be achieved through dedication, wisdom, and genuine compassion applied to the ancient problems of pain, fear, and spiritual isolation that had haunted conscious beings since the beginning of time itself. As the Halig tree grew toward maturity and Miquella's understanding of divine power deepened through years of dedicated study and experimentation, there came to his attention disturbing reports from the fortress of Castle Sol that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between life and death, about the finality of mortality, and about the possibilities that might exist for reversing even the most fundamental forms of loss. These reports spoke of ancient knowledge preserved within the castle's walls, of rituals and ceremonies that might possess the power to restore what had been taken by forces that most beings considered absolutely insurmountable. The relationship between Miquella and the residents of Castle Sol had been forged through shared understanding of what it meant to exist at the margins of accepted reality, to pursue goals that seemed impossible to those who had never experienced the particular forms of suffering that drove such desperate ambition. The castle's inhabitants had long dedicated themselves to the veneration of the eclipse, that rare astronomical phenomenon when the sun's light was temporarily blocked by the moon's passage, creating conditions of darkness and mystery that seemed to offer glimpses into realms normally hidden from mortal perception. For the people of Castle Sol, the eclipse represented far more than mere celestial curiosity or astronomical wonder. It was the central organizing principle of their entire spiritual and philosophical worldview, the key to understanding mysteries that had puzzled the greatest minds throughout the history of the lands between. They believed that the eclipse possessed the power to reveal truths that remained hidden during normal conditions of sunlight and darkness, that the unique combination of light and shadow created during such events could open doorways to possibilities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The eclipse shotel that served as both weapon and ceremonial implement within Castle Sol bore witness to the profound effect that witnessing such phenomena could have upon conscious beings. Its description, speaking of a dreadful awe that prevented observers from averting their gaze, even when instinct urged them to look away from sights too magnificent or terrible for normal comprehension. This weapon had been crafted not merely as an instrument of war, but as a physical embodiment of the principles that guided the castle's inhabitants in their pursuit of knowledge that transcended conventional understanding. The story told by this ancient blade spoke of traditions that stretched back through countless generations, of families and communities that had dedicated themselves across centuries to the patient observation and study of celestial events that most people witnessed only as brief interruptions in the normal patterns of day and night. These were not casual astronomers or amateur skywatchers, but serious scholars whose entire lives had been devoted to understanding the deeper implications of phenomena that operated on scales so vast and according to principles so complex that ordinary human comprehension could barely grasp their significance. When Miquella first learned of Castle Sol's eclipse-centered traditions and their claims about the transformative power of such events, his initial response was one of scholarly skepticism, tempered by genuine curiosity about methodologies that operated so differently from his own approach to divine healing and transformation. The residents of the castle were clearly serious and dedicated individuals whose intellectual abilities and depth of commitment commanded respect. Yet their central claims seemed to challenge some of the most fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and the possibilities for reversing its effects. The Eclipse Crest Heater Shield provided more concrete information about the theoretical framework that underlay Castle Sol's activities, its description revealing that the eclipse was understood to serve as the protective star of soulless demigods, a cosmic force that could somehow shield such beings from the full effects of destined death and maintain them in states that transcended normal categories of existence. This understanding suggested that the eclipse phenomenon possessed properties that went far beyond mere astronomical interest and entered into realms of divine power and cosmic law that operated according to principles that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The connection between the eclipse and the wandering mausoleums that moved across the landscape of the lands, between carrying the remains of dead demigods, provided additional evidence that Castle Sol's theories might possess more substance than mere speculative philosophy. These massive, walking tombs had appeared following the assassination of Godwin the Golden, their purpose apparently being to provide appropriate resting places for beings whose divine nature meant that their deaths carried implications that extended far beyond the normal cessation of individual consciousness. The Mausoleum Knights, who served as guardians for these walking tombs, had voluntarily decapitated themselves in order to follow their masters into death while maintaining sufficient connection to the material world to continue their protective duty. Their headless forms bore eclipse crest shields, suggesting that they understood their service to be connected to the same cosmic principles that Castle Sol sought to harness through their eclipse-centered rituals and ceremonies. The description of these knights as spirits tied to the land through their willing sacrifice provided insight into the mechanisms by which the eclipse might be able to influence the relationship between life and death, consciousness and embodiment, individual identity and cosmic process. If beings could choose to maintain partial existence in the material world even after their physical deaths, then perhaps other forms of manipulation of the life-death boundary might also be possible under the right circumstances and through the application of appropriate knowledge and power. The claim that the eclipse could keep destined death at bay suggested that this cosmic phenomenon possessed the ability to interfere with fundamental laws that governed the transition between states of existence, that the unique conditions created when the sun's light was blocked could somehow provide protection against forces that normally operated with absolute certainty and inevitability. If this understanding were correct, Then the eclipse represented not merely an astronomical event, but a recurring opportunity for intervention in processes that most beings considered utterly beyond the reach of conscious will or divine power. When the phantoms of Castle Sol approached Miquella with their desperate proposal, their words carried the weight of accumulated hope and desperation that had built up over years of theoretical study and careful preparation for a ritual that they believed could accomplish the impossible. These were not wild dreamers or delusional fanatics, but serious practitioners who had devoted their lives to understanding cosmic principles that operated on scales vast enough to dwarf individual concerns about mortality and loss. Their request was both simple and audacious. They believed that by working together, they could perform a ritual that would restore the lost soul of Godwyn the Golden, bringing back to life the consciousness of the demigod, whose assassination had precipitated the creation of those who live in death and fundamentally altered the relationship between mortality and divine power throughout the lands. The magnitude of what they proposed attempting was so great that success would represent a victory over death itself, a demonstration that even the most fundamental cosmic laws could be overcome through the application of sufficient knowledge, power, and determination. For Miquella, the possibility that his beloved elder brother's soul might be restored carried emotional weight that transcended any purely intellectual interest in the theoretical implications of such an achievement. The statue in El Fayel that depicted Godwyn embracing the twin Empyreans spoke to a relationship that had provided both siblings with crucial emotional support during their early development, a bond of love and protection that had been severed when political machinations and divine conflicts had claimed Godwyn as their first victim. The grief that Miquella had experienced following Godwyn's death had been compounded by the horrific transformation that had overtaken his brother's physical remains, the gradual corruption and spread of Deathroot that had turned what should have been a peaceful final rest into an ongoing source of suffering and contamination throughout the world. The sight of Godwyn's body becoming the Prince of Death, spawning the curse that created those who live in death, had been a form of prolonged torture for someone whose love for his brother remained as strong in death as it had been in life. The golden epitaph sword that Miquella had created as a memorial to Godwyn's death had been both an expression of grief and an attempt to honor his brother's memory through the creation of something beautiful and useful that could serve to protect others from the corruption that had claimed him. Yet this weapon, for all its elegance and effectiveness, had always felt inadequate as a response to the magnitude of loss that Godwyn's death represented, a partial gesture toward healing that could never address the fundamental tragedy of a life cut short and a consciousness lost forever to the world. The possibility that Castle Sol's eclipse ritual might be able to restore Godwyn's soul offered hope for a form of healing that went beyond anything Miquella had previously imagined possible, the chance to undo not merely the symptoms of death but death itself, to retrieve from whatever realm it had been taken to the consciousness of someone whose presence in the world had made existence more beautiful and meaningful for all who had known him. If such restoration were indeed possible, it would represent a victory over the forces of destruction and loss that had shaped so much of Miquella's understanding of his own purpose and destiny. Yet the ritual that Castle Sol proposed required resources and capabilities that exceeded what their community could provide on its own, their theoretical understanding and astronomical knowledge needing to be supplemented by the kind of divine power that only an Empyrean could bring to bear upon cosmic forces of such magnitude. Miquella's participation was not merely helpful but absolutely essential, his presence and active involvement being the key factor that could transform their carefully planned ceremony from theoretical possibility into practical reality. The decision to commit himself to Castle Sol's Eclipse project represented a significant departure from Miquella's previous approach to healing and transformation. his earlier work having focused primarily on addressing ongoing suffering rather than attempting to reverse completed tragedies. The needles he had created for millennia, the sanctuary he had built in the Halig tree, the various forms of assistance he had provided through St. Trina all represented efforts to make the best of difficult circumstances rather than attempts to fundamentally alter the cosmic laws that had created those circumstances in the first place. The eclipse ritual demanded a level of ambition that matched Miquella's compassion with his divine power, requiring him to believe that even the most fundamental aspects of reality could be changed through the application of sufficient wisdom and determination. This was not merely healing in the conventional sense, but a form of cosmic surgery that would require cutting into the very fabric of existence itself in order to retrieve something that had been lost to realms beyond normal reach. The months of preparation required for the eclipse ritual tested every aspect of the alliance between Miquella and Castle Sol, their collaboration requiring them to bridge differences in methodology, philosophy, and fundamental understanding of how divine power could be most effectively applied to achieve desired results. The castle's residents brought astronomical knowledge and theoretical frameworks that were largely unfamiliar to Miquella, while he contributed forms of practical experience with divine energy and cosmic forces that complemented their more abstract understanding. The process of learning to work together revealed unexpected complexities in both approaches. Castle Sol's eclipse-centered methodology proving to contain sophisticated insights into the relationship between celestial movements and terrestrial events that Miquella had never previously considered, while his experience with unalloyed principles and direct divine intervention provided practical techniques for channeling and focusing power that the castle's residents had understood only in theoretical terms. As the time for the eclipse ritual approached, both Miquella and his allies at Castle Sol found themselves grappling with questions about the implications of what they were attempting that went far beyond the immediate goal of restoring Godwyn's consciousness. If they succeeded in demonstrating that death could be reversed through the application of appropriate knowledge and power, what would this mean for the cosmic order that had been built upon the assumption that mortality represented a fundamental and insurmountable boundary? The potential consequences of success extended into realms of political and social organization that neither Miquella nor Castle Sol had fully anticipated when they first committed themselves to the project. If death could be overcome, if consciousness could be retrieved from whatever realm it inhabited following the destruction of physical form, then the entire structure of authority and legitimacy that governed the lands between might need to be reconsidered in light of new possibilities and altered relationships between individual beings and cosmic forces. The ritual itself, when it was finally performed under conditions that seemed optimal for success, represented the culmination of years of theoretical study and practical preparation, the convergence of astronomical knowledge and divine power in service of a goal that challenged some of the most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The eclipse that provided the necessary cosmic conditions occurred exactly as the castle's astronomers had predicted, creating the unique combination of light and shadow that their theories suggested would be necessary for opening doorways between normally separate realms of existence. Yet, despite the perfect timing of celestial events and the careful coordination of human effort and divine power, despite the years of preparation and the depth of commitment that all participants brought to the project, the ritual ultimately failed to achieve its intended result. Godwyn's soul remained in whatever distant realm it had been taken to following his assassination, beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated attempts at restoration and retrieval. The phantoms lament that the sun had not been swallowed, that their prayers had been lacking, that his comrade remained soulless, captured something essential about the profound disappointment that followed this failure. These were not individuals who had approached their task casually or without adequate preparation, but serious practitioners who had devoted their lives to understanding the principles they believed could make success possible. Their failure represented not merely personal disappointment, but a fundamental limitation on the possibilities for transformation and healing that even divine power could achieve. The question of what exactly had gone wrong, why the eclipse ritual had failed, despite seemingly optimal conditions and careful preparation, would haunt both Miquella and the survivors at Castle Sol for years to come. Had their theoretical understanding been fundamentally flawed from the beginning, their assumptions about the eclipse's power based upon misinterpretation of phenomena that operated according to different principles than they had supposed? Had the ritual itself been performed incorrectly, some crucial element missing or improperly executed that had prevented success despite adequate preparation and divine assistance? The possibility that Godwin's soul had indeed been retrieved, but in some form or to some location that remained undetectable to ordinary perception, offered hope that the ritual might not have been entirely unsuccessful, that restoration might have occurred in ways that exceeded the participants' ability to recognize or verify. If consciousness could exist in states that transcended normal categories of presence and absence, then perhaps Godwin's return had taken forms that were real but not immediately apparent to those who had worked to achieve it. The alternative explanation, that death represented a boundary so fundamental and absolute that even divine power, combined with sophisticated knowledge, could not overcome it, carried implications that challenged some of Miquella's most basic assumptions about the possibilities for healing and transformation that had motivated his entire approach to addressing suffering. If even the most ambitious and well-executed attempts at restoration could fail completely, what did this suggest about the ultimate limitations that constrained all efforts to create meaningful change in the world? The failure of the eclipse ritual marked a crucial turning point in Miquella's development, forcing him to confront the possibility that love and compassion, however genuine and however supported by divine power and sophisticated understanding, might not be sufficient to overcome all forms of loss and suffering. The recognition that there might be tragedies so fundamental and absolute that they could not be healed or reversed through any conceivable intervention represented a form of spiritual education that his eternal youth had previously protected him from experiencing. Yet the knowledge gained through this failure, however painful, also provided Miquella with insights into the nature of cosmic law and the relationship between individual will and universal principle that would inform all of his subsequent projects and commitments. The understanding that some limitations were absolute rather than merely difficult to overcome helped him to focus his efforts more effectively on goals that remained within the realm of possibility, while the recognition that even divine beings were subject to constraints they could not overcome taught him humility that would prove essential for navigating the challenges that lay ahead. The continued existence of Castle Sol as a center for eclipse-related studies and the preservation of their astronomical knowledge suggested that the failure of the Godwin restoration ritual had not entirely discredited their theoretical framework or eliminated the possibility that future attempts might achieve better results. The eclipse remained a phenomenon of genuine cosmic significance. Its effects upon the relationship between life and death, continuing to offer possibilities for intervention and transformation that conventional approaches could not provide. The Mausoleum Knights, who continued to bear eclipse crest shields and maintain their vigil over the wandering tombs, provided ongoing evidence that the eclipse possessed genuine power to influence the boundary between life and death, even if that power had proven insufficient to achieve the complete restoration that Miquella and Castle Sol had hoped to accomplish. Their successful maintenance of partial existence following voluntary death demonstrated that the principles underlying the eclipse ritual had been sound, even if the specific application to Godwin's case had encountered obstacles that could not be overcome. The memory of the failed eclipse ritual would remain with Miquella throughout all of his subsequent adventures and transformations, a reminder that even the most noble intentions and the most sophisticated methods could not guarantee success against the fundamental constraints that governed existence in the lands between. Yet this memory would also serve as inspiration for continued efforts to push against those constraints wherever possible, to find new approaches to healing and transformation that might succeed where previous attempts had failed. The alliance with Castle Sol, despite its ultimate failure to achieve its primary objective, had provided Miquella with valuable experience in collaborative effort and resource sharing that would inform his approach to future projects requiring cooperation with individuals and communities whose perspectives and methodologies differed significantly from his own. The lesson that different approaches to understanding cosmic principles could complement each other in unexpected ways would prove crucial for his later efforts to create inclusive communities and alternative forms of social organization. The eclipse itself, that mysterious phenomenon that continued to occur according to astronomical schedules, regardless of human hopes and fears, remained a symbol of possibilities that existed beyond ordinary comprehension, a reminder that the universe contained forces and principles that operated according to their own logic rather than in response to conscious desires or expectations. The contemplation of such forces provided a form of spiritual education that complemented Miquella's more direct experience with divine power, teaching him to appreciate the vast scales and complex interactions that characterized cosmic processes, while remaining humble about his own ability to influence or control such phenomena. As Miquella gradually integrated the lessons learned from the failed eclipse ritual into his broader understanding of healing and transformation, he found himself developing a more nuanced appreciation for the relationship between ambition and humility, between the drive to achieve impossible goals and the wisdom to accept inevitable limitations. This integration would prove essential preparation for the even greater challenges that awaited him as his reputation spread throughout the lands between and attracted the attention of forces that viewed his growing power and influence as either opportunity or threat. The years that followed the failure of the eclipse ritual at Castle Sol marked a profound transformation in Miquella's understanding of his own purpose and the methods by which that purpose might best be achieved. As the young Empyrean was forced to confront the reality that even his most ambitious and carefully planned efforts to heal the wounds inflicted by cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension could encounter limitations that no amount of divine power or sophisticated understanding could overcome. The recognition that Godwin's soul remained beyond reach despite the application of astronomical knowledge, celestial timing, and concentrated divine energy represented more than mere disappointment. It was a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had guided his approach to healing and transformation since his earliest rejection of Golden Order fundamentalism. Yet rather than allowing this failure to discourage his continuing efforts, or to convince him that the obstacles facing those who sought to alleviate suffering were insurmountable, Miquella found himself driven to even greater heights of ambition and self-sacrifice. His love for his sister Millennia and his determination to find some way to ease her affliction, becoming the focal point around which all of his energies and resources would be concentrated. The eclipse ritual had taught him that some forms of restoration might be impossible to achieve through external intervention, but it had also demonstrated the tremendous power that could be generated when divine essence was combined with sophisticated knowledge and unwavering commitment to seemingly impossible goals. The decision to embed himself within the Haligtree represented the culmination of years of theoretical development and practical experimentation, the logical endpoint of a journey that had begun with his earliest recognition that conventional approaches to divine healing were inadequate to address the unique challenges posed by his sister's affliction with scarlet rot. If the unalloyed gold needles he had created could provide only temporary relief, if the sanctuary he had built could offer protection but not cure, if even the most ambitious collaborative projects could fail to overcome fundamental cosmic limitations, then perhaps what was required was an approach so radical and so complete that it transcended all previous categories of healing and transformation. The theoretical foundation underlying Miquella's decision to enter into symbiotic union with the Haligtree drew upon his accumulated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and embodiment, between individual identity and cosmic process, that had been developing throughout his years of study and experimentation. The tree that had grown from his blood sacrifice and continued nurturing represented more than merely a physical structure or even a spiritual sanctuary. It had become an extension of his own divine nature, a manifestation of his essence that existed independently in the material world, while remaining fundamentally connected to the consciousness that had created it. The process of embedding himself within the tree's living tissue was not a form of death or even dormancy, but rather a transformation of the mode through which his consciousness could interact with and influence the world around him. Where his previous work had required him to maintain the complex balance between his physical form and his spiritual activities, between his waking presence as Miquella and his dream realm manifestation as Saint Trina, the fusion with the Haligtree offered the possibility of achieving a more complete integration of all aspects of his nature, while simultaneously expanding his capacity to channel divine power on scales that had previously been impossible. The cocoon that formed around Miquella's physical form as he settled into the tree's embrace was not merely protective but transformative, its purpose being to facilitate a process of metamorphosis that would fundamentally alter the relationship between his individual consciousness and the cosmic forces that flowed through him. This was not simple growth or maturation, but something far more radical, a form of divine evolution that would potentially allow him to transcend the limitations that had constrained all of his previous efforts, while gaining access to forms of power and understanding that remained beyond the reach of consciousness operating through conventional, embodied existence. The decision to undertake this transformation required Miquella to confront questions about identity and continuity of self that challenged some of his most basic assumptions about the nature of individual existence and personal responsibility. If the being that eventually emerged from the cocoon possessed capabilities and perspectives that differed significantly from those that had characterized his pre-transformation state, in what sense would that being still be recognizably Miquella? If the process of fusion with the Haligtree fundamentally altered his relationship to memory, emotion, and moral commitment, how could he ensure that his post-transformation self would remain dedicated to the goals and values that had motivated his original decision to undergo such a radical change? These were not merely philosophical concerns, but practical questions that would determine whether his sacrifice would ultimately serve the purposes for which it had been intended, or would instead result in the creation of a being whose power and capabilities were directed toward ends that bore no relationship to the compassionate healing work that had defined his earlier existence. The risk that transformation might lead to fundamental alteration of purpose and character was real and significant, representing a form of death that might be even more complete than the simple cessation of consciousness that conventional mortality entailed. Yet the potential rewards of successful transformation were equally significant and far-reaching, offering possibilities for healing and restoration that extended far beyond anything Miquella had previously been able to achieve through more conventional methods. If the fusion with the Halig tree could provide him with access to forms of divine power that operated on cosmic scales, if it could enable him to influence the fundamental forces that governed life, death, growth, and decay throughout the lands between, then perhaps even afflictions as fundamental and seemingly incurable as millennia's scarlet rot might finally yield to properly applied intervention. The process of entering the cocoon was both physically and spiritually demanding, requiring Miquella to gradually release his attachment to familiar forms of sensory experience and conscious control, while maintaining sufficient coherence of purpose and identity to guide the transformation process toward desired outcomes. This required a level of trust in cosmic forces and natural processes that challenged every aspect of his previous approach to problem solving, which had relied heavily upon careful planning, conscious control, and the methodical application of theoretical knowledge to practical challenges. The early stages of the transformation process tested Miquella's resolve in ways that even his years of dedicated self-sacrifice had not prepared him for, as the gradual dissolution of familiar boundaries between self and environment, consciousness and unconsciousness, individual will and cosmic process created forms of disorientation and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm his capacity to maintain coherent purpose and direction. The cocoon environment was simultaneously womb and tomb, offering the promise of rebirth while requiring the acceptance of a form of death that was potentially more complete than anything he had previously contemplated. Yet as the transformation progressed, and Miquella began to adapt to the radically altered states of consciousness that the process required, he found himself gaining access to forms of perception and understanding that had been completely unavailable during his earlier, more conventionally embodied existence. The fusion with the Halig tree provided him with direct sensory connection to the tree's extensive root system, allowing him to perceive and influence events occurring throughout the entire region that the tree's underground network encompassed. This expanded awareness revealed aspects of the relationship between individual consciousness and environmental conditions that had previously existed beyond the reach of his understanding, demonstrating how the health and vitality of conscious beings was intimately connected to the spiritual and physical condition of the landscape they inhabited. The recognition that healing individual afflictions might require addressing broader environmental and cosmic imbalances suggested possibilities for intervention that operated on scales vast enough to address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. The connection between Miquella's cocoon and the tree's root system also provided him with access to forms of nourishment and energy that transcended the normal requirements of embodied existence, his consciousness being sustained by the same flows of life force that maintained the tree's growth and development. This liberation from conventional biological needs created unprecedented opportunities for sustained, focused attention and extended periods of deep contemplation that would have been impossible while maintaining responsibility for physical, survival, and social interaction. The womb-like chamber within the Halig tree that cradled Miquella's cocoon was itself a marvel of natural architecture and divine engineering, its organic curves and flowing surfaces designed to provide optimal conditions for the kind of radical transformation that he was attempting to achieve. The walls of this sacred space pulsed with the same life force that flowed through the tree's branches and roots, creating an environment where the boundary between individual organism and cosmic process became increasingly fluid and ultimately meaningless. The form suggested by the tree's internal structure, the feminine figure whose womb provided the space for Miquella's metamorphosis, raised profound questions about the relationship between masculine and feminine principles within divine consciousness and the role that gender identity might play in the transformation process he was undergoing. If the tree had indeed taken on aspects of feminine embodiment in order to provide appropriate conditions for his rebirth, then the being that eventually emerged might represent a synthesis of qualities and perspectives that transcended the limitations associated with any single gender identity. This possibility that transformation might involve fundamental changes in the nature of identity itself, including but not limited to questions of gender and embodiment, connected Miquella's current process to the earlier mystery of Saint Trina and the relationship between his various aspects and manifestations. The feminine appearance associated with Saint Trina might have been not merely an alternative persona or dream realm manifestation, but a preview of the kind of integrated consciousness that full transformation could eventually achieve. The years required for the metamorphosis to progress through its various stages tested not only Miquella's individual capacity for sustained commitment, but also the faith and loyalty of all those who had come to depend upon his process, guidance, and protection. The Haligtree community that had flourished under his direct leadership found itself forced to maintain its principles and practices without the immediate presence of the consciousness that had originally inspired and organized their efforts, creating challenges that tested every aspect of their collective commitment to the vision he had articulated. The withering of Miquella's lilies throughout Elphael provided visible evidence of the tree's dependence upon his continued presence and active participation in maintaining the spiritual conditions that allowed the sanctuary to function effectively. Without the constant flow of unalloyed divine essence that his embedded consciousness had provided, the defensive barriers that protected the community from external corruption began to weaken, allowing various forms of spiritual contamination to seep into spaces that had previously been perfectly pure. The guards who maintained their vigilant watch despite the increasingly evident signs of their lord's prolonged absence embodied a form of faith that transcended immediate evidence and practical considerations, their continued service representing a commitment to principles and relationships that existed independently of any expectation of immediate reward or recognition. Their willingness to continue protecting a community whose spiritual foundation was clearly under stress demonstrated the kind of loyalty and dedication that Miquella's vision had been able to inspire in those who understood its significance. The dejected postures and outward-gazing attention that characterized these faithful guardians reflected their awareness that the sanctuary they protected faced threats that could not be addressed through conventional military means, that the real battle for the Haligtree's survival was taking place in spiritual and cosmic dimensions that remained largely beyond their ability to perceive or influence directly. Their vigilance was both practically necessary and symbolically important, maintaining visible commitment to defensive principles, even when the effectiveness of such defense had become increasingly questionable. The discovery that the sacred light within these guardians would explode upon their deaths, potentially causing harm to the very people they had dedicated their lives to protecting, added another layer of tragedy to their service, while also providing evidence of the complex and sometimes paradoxical nature of divine power when channeled through mortal vessels. This explosive potential represented both blessing and curse, a form of sacred energy that could serve defensive purposes, but only at the cost of the guardian's life and with the risk of unintended consequences. The spirit ashes that preserved the final thoughts and commitments of these faithful servants revealed the depth of their dedication to Miquella's vision and their hope that even their deaths might serve some useful purpose in facilitating his eventual return. Their willingness to embrace the possibility that their own destruction might serve as a guiding beacon for their absent lord demonstrated a level of self-sacrifice that rivaled Miquella's own commitment to his transformative project. Millennia's vigil beside the withering halig tree represented perhaps the most poignant aspect of the entire situation. Her unwavering faith in her brother's promise, serving as both inspiration and rebuke to those whose confidence in his eventual return had begun to waver under the pressure of extended uncertainty. Her presence at the base of the dying tree created a powerful visual symbol of loyalty that transcended rational analysis, love that persisted despite mounting evidence that the object of such devotion might no longer exist in any form capable of returning that affection. The armor that Millennia wore during this extended period of waiting, crafted by Miquella's own hands and imbued with his unalloyed gold, served as both practical protection and spiritual connection to the brother whose promise had become the organizing principle of her existence. This armor represented more than mere equipment. It was a physical manifestation of the bond between the twins, a tangible reminder of the love and dedication that had motivated all of Miquella's healing work. Her belief that Miquella would return to fulfill whatever promise he had made to her raised questions about the specific nature of that commitment and the extent to which she understood the risks and implications of the transformation process he had undertaken. Had he assured her that his metamorphosis would ultimately provide him with the power to cure her scarlet rot completely? Had he promised merely to return in some form that would allow their relationship to continue despite his radically altered state? Had he made commitments that extended beyond their personal bond to encompass the broader community that depended upon both of them for guidance and protection? The corpses that surrounded Millennia during her vigil, the remains of those who had challenged her during the long years of waiting, provided grim evidence of the lengths to which she would go to protect her brother's resting place and maintain the conditions necessary for his eventual return. These were not the bodies of random attackers or casual intruders, but the remains of beings who had possessed sufficient power and determination to penetrate the halig tree's defenses and confront one of the most formidable warriors in all the lands between. The fact that such powerful opponents had been drawn to challenge Millennia during Miquella's absence suggested that knowledge of his vulnerable state had spread beyond the boundaries of his immediate community, attracting the attention of forces that viewed his transformation either as an opportunity to eliminate a potential rival or as a chance to claim whatever power might be gained through interrupting or corrupting the metamorphosis process. The diversity of these challenges and the persistence with which they had continued to arrive, despite the evident fate of their predecessors, indicated that the stakes involved in Miquella's transformation were understood to extend far beyond personal or local concerns. The dream in which Millennia found refuge during her extended vigil provided her with a form of psychological protection that allowed her to maintain hope despite the increasingly evident signs that her brother's transformation was taking far longer than anyone had anticipated and might ultimately fail to achieve its intended results. These dreams might have offered her glimpses of possible futures where Miquella's return brought the healing and restoration that had been promised, or they might have provided simple escape from the harsh realities of prolonged separation and mounting uncertainty. The question of whether these dreams were merely products of her own desperate hopes and psychological needs, or whether they might have contained genuine communication from Miquella's transformed consciousness raised possibilities that connected to his earlier work as Saint Trina and his demonstrated ability to influence and heal through dream realm activities. If some aspect of his consciousness remained capable of reaching across the barriers created by his physical transformation, then Millennia's dreams might have served as a form of spiritual sustenance that made her extended vigil possible. The phantom who had somehow divined the location of Miquella's captivity and pointed toward the portal that led to Mogwin Palace provided the first concrete evidence that the transformation process had been interrupted through external intervention rather than completed according to its natural progression. This revelation that Miquella had been taken from his cocoon prematurely, before the metamorphosis could reach its intended conclusion, explained both the withering of the halig tree and the failure of his promised return to materialize according to expected timelines. The implications of this forced interruption extended far beyond simple kidnapping or political manipulation, as the removal of Miquella from the halig tree during the most vulnerable stage of his transformation had potentially damaged both his individual development and the cosmic processes that had been set in motion through his sacrifice. The tree's subsequent decay and the community's spiritual crisis were not merely consequences of his physical absence, but evidence of deeper disruptions in the flow of divine energy and purpose that had sustained the entire project. The identity of the being responsible for this intervention, the Omen demigod Mog, who had somehow gained access to the most protected sanctuary in all the lands between, raised disturbing questions about the security measures that had been established to protect Miquella during his transformation, and the possibility that his location and vulnerable state had been betrayed by someone with intimate knowledge of the halig tree's defenses and internal organization. The fact that Moog had been able to breach defenses that had successfully repelled numerous other challengers and reached the very heart of the tree where Miquella's cocoon was housed suggested either that he possessed capabilities that exceeded those of other potential threats, or that he had received assistance from sources that understood the sanctuary's weaknesses and protective systems. The success of his intervention indicated that even the most carefully planned and protected transformation processes remained vulnerable to disruption by forces that operated according to different principles and priorities. The torn cocoon from which Miquella had been removed bore witness to the violence of this interruption, its shredded remains providing evidence that the removal had been accomplished through force rather than through any form of cooperation or voluntary departure. The damage to the cocoon's protective structure suggested that the metamorphosis had been halted at a particularly crucial stage, potentially causing forms of spiritual and developmental harm that might prove impossible to repair, even if Miquella were eventually rescued and returned to appropriate conditions for continued transformation. The withering of the halig tree that followed this forced removal provided visible confirmation of the intimate connection between Miquella's consciousness and the spiritual health of the entire sanctuary, demonstrating that his presence and active participation had been more than merely beneficial, but absolutely essential for maintaining the cosmic conditions that allowed the community to function according to its founding principles. Without the constant flow of divine essence that his embedded consciousness had provided, the tree and everything it supported began a process of decline that threatened to undo years of careful cultivation and spiritual development. As news of Miquella's disappearance spread throughout the scattered communities that had looked to him for guidance and inspiration, the responses ranged from desperate attempts to locate and rescue him to gradual abandonment of the principles and practices he had established. As various groups and individuals struggled to determine how to proceed in the absence of the consciousness that had provided both practical leadership and spiritual foundation for their activities. The crisis created by Miquella's forced removal from the halig tree represented more than simply the loss of a leader or the interruption of an individual transformation process. It was a fundamental challenge to the entire vision of alternative social organization and spiritual practice that he had spent years developing and implementing. The question of whether his work could survive and continue to evolve in his absence would test every aspect of the communities and relationships he had created, determining whether the values and methods he had established possessed sufficient strength and coherence to persist independently of his direct guidance and protection. In the deepest chambers beneath the royal capital of Leyndell, where the ancient stones had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties beyond counting, and the very foundations of the earth bore the scars of conflicts that predated recorded history, there existed a realm of exile and abandonment that few among the surface dwellers ever suspected or dared to contemplate. This was the subterranean shunning grounds, a place where those deemed unfit for civilized society were cast away to live or die according to their own devices, forgotten by the world above, save when their existence served as cautionary tale or convenient threat to ensure conformity among those fortunate enough to remain within the bounds of accepted normality. It was in this forsaken realm that Mog the Omen had been condemned to spend his earliest years, cast down into darkness and filth, not for any crime he had committed or choice he had made, but simply for the circumstances of his birth, for the physical characteristics that marked him as different from those who were permitted to dwell in sunlight and comfort. The curse of his omen nature had manifested itself in horns and twisted flesh that spoke of ancient connections to primordial forces that the Golden Order had long sought to suppress and control, his very existence serving as a reminder of chaotic energies that threatened the carefully maintained order of Marika's civilized world. Yet where his twin brother Morgoth had responded to this exile and rejection with a desperate desire to prove himself worthy of acceptance, to demonstrate through loyalty and service that he could transcend the circumstances of his birth and earn a place within the system that had cast him out, Mog's reaction to their shared fate had been fundamentally different in both character and implication. Rather than seeking to overcome his omen nature or to apologize for characteristics beyond his control, he had embraced the very qualities that made him an outcast, finding in his apparent cursedness a source of power and identity that offered alternative paths to meaning and fulfillment. This fundamental difference in their responses to shared trauma had shaped the entirety of Mog's subsequent development, leading him down pathways of thought and experience that diverged radically from anything his brother could understand or approve. Where Morgoth sought redemption through self-denial and service to authorities who had never shown him kindness, Mog discovered in his exile opportunities for forms of self-exploration and spiritual development that were impossible within the constraints of civilized society and its carefully maintained hierarchies of acceptable behavior, belief. The accursed blood that flowed through Mog's veins, the same tainted essence that had marked him for exile and made him an object of fear and revulsion to those who encountered him, gradually revealed itself to possess qualities and capabilities that transcended ordinary understanding of what blood could be or do. This was not merely the crimson fluid that sustained physical life, but something far more complex and potent, a substance that carried within itself connections to cosmic forces and primordial energies that had been active in the world long before the Golden Order's establishment and would continue to operate long after its eventual decline. The process by which Mog learned to work with and channel the power contained within his accursed blood was neither swift nor simple, requiring him to develop forms of spiritual discipline and physical conditioning that had no precedent in established traditions of magical or religious practice. He was forced to become his own teacher and guide, experimenting with techniques and approaches that carried tremendous risks while offering possibilities for transformation and empowerment that conventional methods could never provide. It was during this period of solitary experimentation and spiritual exploration that Mog first encountered the presence that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his existence and provide him with access to forms of power and understanding that placed him among the most formidable beings in all the lands between. This was the entity known by various names throughout different traditions and cultures, called sometimes the Mother of Truth and other times the Formless Mother, a consciousness so alien and vast that mortal minds could barely grasp the edges of its nature and purpose. The meeting between Mohg and the Formless Mother took place in realms of experience that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary physical sensation, in spaces where consciousness could encounter forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of existence and identity. This was not a casual encounter or accidental discovery, but a convergence of destinies that had been building across years of preparation and development. The inevitable meeting between a consciousness that had been shaped by exile and rejection, and a cosmic force that existed entirely outside the structures of accepted reality. The validation that the Formless Mother provided for Mohg's accursed blood and omen nature represented more than simple acceptance of characteristics that others had found repulsive or threatening. This cosmic entity actively celebrated the qualities that had made him an outcast, recognizing in his twisted form and tainted essence exactly the kind of vessel through which her own alien purposes could be most effectively pursued and implemented in the material world. The relationship that developed between Mohg and the Formless Mother was simultaneously deeply personal and utterly cosmic in its implications, combining elements of devotion and possession, worship and utilization, in ways that challenged conventional understanding of the boundaries between individual consciousness and universal force. Through this relationship, Mohg gained access to forms of power that transformed him from outcast and exile into something approaching a god in his own right, while the Formless Mother gained a devoted servant whose capabilities and position allowed her influence to extend into realms that would otherwise have remained beyond her reach. The blood flame that Mohg learned to command through his connection to the Formless Mother represented a fusion of his own accursed essence with the alien energies that flowed through her cosmic being, creating a form of magic that was uniquely his own, while remaining fundamentally connected to powers that operated on scales vast enough to influence the fundamental structures of reality itself. This flame was not merely destructive but transformative, capable of altering the essential nature of whatever it touched while serving as a medium through which Mohg's will could be expressed and implemented across vast distances and through multiple dimensions of existence. The weapons and techniques that Mohg developed through his exploration of blood flame magic reflected both his own creative genius and the alien intelligence that guided his experimentation, resulting in approaches to combat and manipulation that were unlike anything employed by other practitioners of divine or arcane arts. His sacred spear served simultaneously as instrument of war and tool of communion, its design allowing him to channel blood flame with unprecedented precision, while maintaining the kind of spiritual connection to the Formless Mother that was necessary for accessing her most profound secrets and capabilities. The establishment of the Mohgwyn dynasty represented Mohg's most ambitious attempt to create a lasting legacy that could survive his individual existence, while providing a framework for the continued worship and service of the Blongor Formless Mother long after his own eventual demise or transformation. This dynasty was not merely a political organization or territorial claim, but a spiritual movement dedicated to principles and practices that challenged every assumption about proper relationships between conscious beings and cosmic forces. The location chosen for the dynasty's seat of power reflected Mohg's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical space and spiritual energy. The underground realm, where he established his court, being situated at the intersection of multiple streams of cosmic force that could be tapped and channeled for purposes that served both his individual ambitions and the broader goals of the entity he served. The ancient dynastic remains that provided the foundation for his new construction spoke of previous civilizations that had understood similar principles, their architectural achievements serving as inspiration and practical resource for his own building projects. The recruitment and training of followers for the Mogwin dynasty required Mog to develop forms of teaching and initiation that could prepare ordinary consciousness for the kind of radical transformation that service to the formless mother demanded. These were not casual converts or political opportunists, but individuals who had been carefully selected and gradually prepared for the profound changes in identity and purpose that genuine devotion to cosmic forces would inevitably require. The blood offerings that became central to Mogwin dynasty practices represented more than ritualistic sacrifice or symbolic gesture, serving as practical methods for channeling the kind of life force and spiritual energy that the formless mother required for maintaining her influence in the material world, while simultaneously providing initiates with direct experience of the transformative power that could be accessed through willing surrender of individual essence for cosmic purpose. Yet for all the genuine spiritual development and cosmic connection that Mog achieved through his relationship with the formless mother, for all the political and military power that the Mogwin dynasty represented, there remained within his consciousness a fundamental emptiness that no amount of external achievement or spiritual advancement seemed capable of filling completely. This void was not merely psychological or emotional, but ontological, a gap in the very structure of his being that related to questions of purpose and meaning that transcended individual satisfaction or cosmic connection. The solution to this existential crisis, when it finally presented itself to Mog's awareness, took the form of another being whose divine nature and extraordinary capabilities offered possibilities for completing the spiritual development that he had been pursuing throughout his years of exile and transformation. Miquella the Unalloyed, despite his eternal youth and apparently gentle nature, possessed qualities that Moch recognized as perfectly complementary to his own characteristics and ambitions, representing the missing element that could transform his relationship to cosmic forces from mere service into something approaching genuine partnership and co-creation. The decision to pursue Miquella as a potential consort was not based upon casual attraction or political opportunism, but upon profound spiritual insight into the nature of divine consciousness and the possibilities that could emerge from the proper combination of complementary essences and capabilities. Mog understood that Miquella's unalloyed nature and healing-focused approach to divine power could provide exactly the kind of balance and completion that would allow their combined consciousness to achieve levels of cosmic influence and transformative capability that neither could reach independently. The process of locating Miquella during his vulnerable period of transformation within the Haligtree required Mog to employ all of the intelligence-gathering resources and supernatural sensing capabilities that he had developed through his years of building the Mogwin dynasty and exploring the limits of blood flame magic. This was not simply a matter of physical reconnaissance, but of spiritual detection, requiring him to perceive and track forms of divine energy that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that governed his own powers and abilities. The penetration of the Haligtree's defenses and the successful extraction of Miquella from his cocoon represented one of the most complex and dangerous operations that Mog had ever undertaken, requiring him to overcome protective measures that had been specifically designed to resist exactly the kind of intervention he was attempting. The success of this mission testified not only to his individual capabilities, but to the cosmic support that the formless mother was willing to provide for projects that served her broader purposes and ambitions. The physical removal of Miquella from the Haligtree was accomplished through methods that combined supernatural power with careful planning and precise execution, though the violence necessary to breach the cocoon's protective structure meant that the extraction could not be completed without causing potential damage to the very being he sought to preserve and transform. This tension between the desire to possess and the need to protect would become a defining characteristic of Mohg's subsequent relationship with his captive consort. The establishment of appropriate conditions for Miquella's continued development within the Mohgwyn dynasty's underground realm required Mohg to create a new form of cocoon environment that could provide necessary protection and nourishment while remaining under his direct control and influence. The construction of this artificial womb represented a fusion of his understanding of blood flame magic with more conventional knowledge of divine physiology and spiritual development, resulting in a containment system that was simultaneously prison and sanctuary. The positioning of this new cocoon atop the giant pelvic bone that dominated the central chamber of Mohg's court was both practically necessary and symbolically significant, providing the elevated platform required for proper energy circulation, while serving as a constant reminder of the reproductive and creative possibilities that their union was intended to eventually achieve. This arrangement reflected Mohg's understanding that divine transformation was fundamentally connected to cycles of death and rebirth that required appropriate physical and spiritual frameworks for successful completion. The blood offerings that Mohg solicited from his followers and directed toward Miquella's cocoon represented his attempt to accelerate and influence the transformation process through the application of external spiritual energy and Bay, life force, his hope being that sufficient quantities of properly prepared essence could compensate for whatever damage had been done during the extraction process, while providing the raw materials necessary for continued development and eventual awakening. The proclamation that these offerings would drench his consort's chamber and slake the cocoon's thirst reflected Mohg's understanding of divine transformation as fundamentally connected to processes of consumption and base assimilation, his belief being that Miquella's awakening would require not only time and protected development, but active nourishment from sources that could provide the kinds of spiritual energy and cosmic connection that his own isolated nature could not supply independently. The promise that Miquella's awakening would herald the dawn of a new dynasty represented Mohg's ultimate ambition for their relationship, his vision being that their combined consciousness and complementary capabilities could create forms of cosmic influence and transformative power that would fundamentally alter the balance of forces throughout the lands between, while establishing new principles and practices for the relationship between individual consciousness and universal order. Yet the continued unresponsiveness of Miquella to all of Mohg's efforts and offerings gradually forced him to confront the possibility that the transformation he had envisioned might not proceed according to his expectations or timeline, that the combination of extraction, trauma, and fundamental incompatibility between their respective natures might have created obstacles that no amount of external energy or devoted attention could overcome. The recognition that divine consciousness could not be compelled or controlled through force alone represented a form of spiritual education that challenged some of Mohg's most basic assumptions about power and possession. The growth that gradually became apparent in Miquella's physical form during his captivity provided evidence that some form of development was indeed taking place within the artificial cocoon, though the nature and direction of these changes remained unclear and potentially troubling to Mohg's original plans and expectations. This growth might represent the natural continuation of interrupted transformation processes, or it might indicate entirely different developments that bore no relationship to the outcomes he had hoped to achieve through their forced union. The Pureblood Knight's medal that proclaimed patience while awaiting the new dynasty reflected both genuine faith in eventual success and growing uncertainty about the timeline and ultimate results of the project. The suggestion that it was not yet time serving as both encouragement for continued effort and acknowledgement that the current situation might need to persist for periods longer than originally anticipated. The resemblance between Mog's situation and certain themes and imagery from works that had inspired the creation of the Lands Between suggested that his relationship with Miquella might be intended to explore questions about consent, transformation, and the ethics of attempting to compel others to participate in visions they had not chosen for themselves. The possibility that Miquella's apparent cooperation might mask forms of resistance or manipulation that Mog was not sophisticated enough to detect raised troubling questions about the true nature of their interaction and the likelihood that his ultimate goals could be achieved through the methods he was employing. The theoretical possibility that Miquella might be actively manipulating the situation for his own purposes, using his demonstrated ability to compel affection and influence others' emotions to gradually gain control over his captor, while appearing to remain helplessly imprisoned, added layers of complexity to their relationship that challenged simple categories of victim and victimizer, prisoner and jailer, dominated and dominating consciousness. The amber starlight found at Miquella's hideaway, described as representing the very fate of a demigod, provided tantalizing hints about the ultimate destination of divine consciousness and the possibility that transformation processes that appeared to be interrupted or corrupted might actually be proceeding according to cosmic schedules and principles that operated independently of individual will or external intervention. As Mode continued his patient vigil beside the cocoon that held his captured consort, maintaining faith in visions and promises that had yet to manifest in any recognizable form, the tension between hope and reality, between cosmic ambition and earthly limitation, between genuine spiritual development and elaborate self-deception, continued to build towards some form of resolution that would determine not only their individual fates, but the future direction of divine consciousness throughout the fine Lands Between. The chamber where this cosmic drama unfolded remained filled with the sound of Mog's continued proclamations, and the steady pulse of blood offerings being channeled toward their mysterious recipient, while the figure within the cocoon maintained the same inscrutable silence that had characterized his presence since the beginning of their forced association, leaving all observers to wonder whether divine transformation was indeed taking place, or whether they were witnessing the gradual elaboration of a magnificent delusion that would ultimately consume both participants in its beautiful and terrible logic. In the depths of consciousness where dreams and waking thought converge like streams flowing together into an ocean of infinite possibility, where the boundaries that normally separate individual awareness from cosmic understanding become fluid and permeable, there exists a realm of experience that few mortal minds have ever glimpsed, and fewer still have survived encountering with their sanity intact. This is the domain where divine consciousness retreats when the pressures of material existence become too great to bear, where beings of tremendous power and complexity can explore aspects of their own nature that remain forever hidden from those who encounter them only through conventional, physical interaction. It was into this mysterious realm that Miquella's awareness had withdrawn during the long period of his captivity within Mog's artificial cocoon, his consciousness finding refuge in inner spaces that no external force could penetrate or control, no matter how sophisticated their methods, or how complete their apparent dominion over his physical form. This retreat was not defeat or surrender, but rather a form of strategic withdrawal that allowed him to preserve the essential core of his identity and purpose, while appearing to remain helplessly imprisoned within the blood-soaked chambers of the Mohgwyn dynasty. The relationship between Miquella's dream realm activities and the physical transformations that were gradually becoming apparent in his cocoon-bound form remained one of the greatest mysteries surrounding his current condition raising profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the degree to which mental and spiritual processes could influence material reality, even when separated from normal channels of expression and implementation. If his awareness had indeed found ways to operate independently of his captive body, then the apparent passivity that characterized his response to Mog's offerings and proclamations might mask forms of activity and influence that operated according to principles entirely different from those that governed conventional conscious experience. The possibility that Miquella's consciousness was actively engaged in exploring and developing capabilities that transcended his previous limitations offered hope that his enforced isolation might ultimately prove to be not merely endurable but transformative in ways that even his original cocoon within the haligtree had never achieved. The artificial environment created by Mog's devotion and the constant influx of blood offerings, however misguided their intent, might have provided exactly the kind of concentrated spiritual energy and protected development space that divine transformation required for reaching levels of integration and empowerment that had previously remained beyond reach. Yet this optimistic interpretation of his situation had to be balanced against the equally real possibility that the trauma of forced extraction and the fundamentally corrupting influence of his captor's intentions had caused forms of spiritual damage that no amount of inner work or mystical development could completely heal or overcome. The violation of consent that characterized every aspect of his captivity might have created psychic wounds that would continue to influence his development regardless of whatever compensatory growth or adaptation he managed to achieve in response to his circumstances. The dreams that might serve as Miquella's primary refuge during this period of enforced passivity would necessarily be unlike any that ordinary consciousness could generate or sustain, their scope and complexity reflecting both his divine nature and the extraordinary pressures that had been brought to bear upon his psyche. These would not be simple escape fantasies or wish fulfillment scenarios, but elaborate alternative realities where different versions of his life and development could be explored, where relationships that had been severed or corrupted in the material world could be restored and perfected, where the healing and transformation work that had been interrupted could continue according to its own internal logic and timeline. Within these dream realms, Miquella might encounter versions of himself that had never been subjected to Mog's interference, consciousness streams where the haligtree had achieved its full potential, and the sanctuary he had envisioned had become a thriving center of healing and transformation that served as a beacon of hope throughout the lands between. In such dreams, his relationship with Melania might have found the resolution that their waking existence had been denied, her scarlet rot finally yielding to treatments that combined his unalloyed gold with insights gained through successful communion with cosmic forces that operated beyond the reach of outer god influence. The Saint Trina aspect of his consciousness, which had been forced into silence during the period leading up to his cocoon transformation, might find new expression and development within these dream realms. Her capacity for providing healing through altered states of consciousness, expanding to encompass forms of spiritual therapy and collective transformation that had never been possible during her earlier, more limited manifestations in the material world. The songs and lullabies that had once provided comfort to the frenzied merchants might evolve into cosmic harmonies capable of healing divisions not only within individual consciousness, but between entire communities and races. The possibility that these dream activities might somehow influence events in the material world, that consciousness operating at sufficient depth and intensity could create forms of causation that transcended normal categories of cause and effect, raised intriguing questions about the ultimate scope and implications of Miquella's current situation. If his inner development during captivity was indeed progressing toward levels of integration and empowerment that exceeded anything he had previously achieved, then his eventual return to active engagement with external reality might herald transformations that would fundamentally alter the balance of forces throughout the lands between. The growth that had become increasingly apparent in Miquella's physical form during his time within Mog's artificial cocoon might represent the material manifestation of spiritual development that was taking place primarily within dream realms, his body gradually adapting to accommodate consciousness that was expanding beyond the limitations that had previously constrained its expression and implementation. This growth might not be merely physical but ontological, reflecting changes in the fundamental nature of his being that transcended normal categories of development and maturation. The question of whether this transformation was proceeding according to Miquella's own intentions and timeline, or whether it had been irrevocably altered and potentially corrupted by the circumstances of his captivity, would determine not only his individual fate but the broader implications of his eventual return to active participation in the conflicts and challenges that faced the lands between. If his development had indeed been compromised or misdirected by Mog's interference, then his awakening might bring not the healing and restoration that his followers anticipated, but forms of power and purpose that bore little relationship to the compassionate vision that had originally motivated his work. Yet the alternative possibility that his consciousness had found ways to continue developing according to its own internal logic despite external pressures and constraints suggested that the Miquella who eventually emerged from captivity might possess capabilities and insights that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of his original potential. The enforced period of contemplation and inner work, however traumatic its initiation, might have provided him with opportunities for forms of spiritual integration and cosmic understanding that would never have been available through more conventional paths of development. The relationship between Miquella's dream realm activities and the continued faith maintained by those who awaited his return and created possibilities for forms of spiritual connection and mutual influence that operated independently of physical proximity or conventional communication. Millennia's unwavering belief in his promise, the dedication of the Haligtree guards who maintained their vigil despite mounting evidence of failure, the scattered communities throughout the lands between that continued to practice principles and methods he had established, all represented forms of spiritual energy and focused intention that might serve to sustain and guide his development even across the barriers created by his imprisonment. This network of faith and expectation might provide Miquella with access to resources and capabilities that his individual consciousness could never generate independently. The collective hope and dedication of those who continued to believe in his vision, serving as a form of spiritual nourishment that could sustain even the most ambitious forms of transformation and development. The recognition that consciousness was fundamentally interconnected rather than isolated, that individual development could be supported and enhanced through properly focused collective attention and intention, opened possibilities for forms of healing and empowerment that transcended normal assumptions about the relationship between personal and social transformation. The various forms of resistance and opposition that Miquella's vision had encountered throughout his active period, the forces that had ultimately led to his capture and enforced withdrawal from public engagement, might themselves serve as sources of insight and development that could inform more effective approaches to achieving his original goals. The understanding gained through experiencing the full range of responses that his work had generated, from devoted loyalty to violent opposition, could provide him with a more complete and realistic assessment of the challenges that any genuine attempt at social and spiritual transformation would need to overcome. The failure of the eclipse ritual at Castle Sol, the gradual decline of the Haligtree Sanctuary, the corruption of well-intentioned followers, and the misunderstanding of carefully articulated principles, all represented forms of education that could inform more sophisticated and resilient approaches to the work of healing and transformation. The recognition that even the most noble intentions could be frustrated by factors beyond individual control, that even the most carefully planned projects could encounter obstacles that no amount of preparation could anticipate, might lead to the development of methodologies that were simultaneously more ambitious in scope and more realistic in their assessment of what could actually be achieved within the constraints of existing cosmic conditions. The possibility that Miquella's period of enforced contemplation might result in the development of entirely new approaches to divine transformation and social healing, methods that combined the wisdom gained through his earlier successes and failures, with insights that could only be achieved through the kind of profound isolation and inner work that his captivity had imposed, suggested that his eventual return might represent not merely the continuation of interrupted projects, but the inauguration of entirely new phases of development and activity. The dreams that served as his primary realm of activity during this period might include visions of possible futures where the lessons learned through suffering and loss had been integrated into more effective approaches to the ancient problems of pain, corruption, and spiritual fragmentation that had plagued conscious beings throughout the history of the lands between. These visions might reveal forms of healing and transformation that operated through principles so different from his earlier methods that their implementation would require fundamental changes, not only in his own approach, but in the expectations and understanding of those who sought to support and participate in such work. The question of whether these visionary insights would prove to be practically applicable when the time came for their implementation in the material world, or whether they would remain beautiful dreams that could not survive contact with the harsh realities of political power and cosmic limitation, would ultimately determine the significance and lasting impact of Miquella's period of enforced withdrawal. The history of divine consciousness in the lands between was filled with examples of beings whose theoretical understanding and spiritual insight had exceeded their practical ability to create lasting change, whose visions of transformation had remained forever unrealized, despite their tremendous power and dedication. Yet the unique circumstances of Miquella's development, his combination of eternal youth with profound spiritual maturity, his experience of both tremendous success and devastating failure, his exposure to forms of love and corruption that exceeded normal human understanding, suggested that he might possess exactly the combination of qualities and experiences necessary to bridge the gap between visionary insight and practical implementation that had frustrated so many previous attempts at genuine transformation and healing. The networks of relationship and mutual support that had grown up around his work during his active period, the communities and individuals whose lives had been fundamentally altered by their contact with his vision and methods, represented resources and capabilities that could potentially be reactivated and redirected when the time came for his return to public engagement. These relationships, seasoned by the test of prolonged separation and uncertainty, might prove to be more resilient and effective than the initial enthusiasm and naive optimism that had characterized his earlier following. The understanding that genuine transformation required not only individual development but collective commitment, not only spiritual insight but practical organization, not only pure intention but sophisticated strategy, might inform approaches to social change that were simultaneously more radical and more sustainable than anything he had previously attempted. The recognition that healing work inevitably attracted forms of opposition and corruption that needed to be anticipated and addressed rather than simply hoped against could lead to the development of defensive and protective measures that would allow transformative projects to survive and flourish, despite hostile environments. As the period of Miquella's captivity continued, and the signs of his physical and spiritual development became increasingly apparent to those with sufficient sensitivity to perceive them, the question of timing became increasingly crucial to understanding the ultimate implications of his situation. The recognition that divine transformation operated according to cosmic schedules that might bear little relationship to human expectations or desires suggested that his eventual awakening might occur not when his followers expected or hoped, but when the broader conditions throughout the lands between had developed to the point where his return could achieve maximum effectiveness and lasting impact. The possibility that his consciousness was not merely developing individually, but actively monitoring and influencing the evolution of events throughout the world, using dream realm activities to maintain awareness of changing circumstances while gradually preparing for the optimal moment to resume direct engagement with material reality, raised intriguing questions about the scope and sophistication of divine consciousness, operating at such levels of integration and cosmic awareness. The signs and portents that careful observers might detect in the patterns of events throughout the lands between, the subtle shifts in the balance of forces that suggested approaching culmination of cycles that had been building across years or decades, might provide clues about the timing and nature of Miquella's eventual return. The understanding that individual transformation was intimately connected to cosmic processes that operated on scales vast enough to dwarf human comprehension suggested that his awakening would coincide not merely with the completion of personal development, but with broader changes that would create optimal conditions for the implementation of whatever vision had been developing during his period of enforced contemplation. The dream of a world where all things could flourish, whether graceful or malign, where the ancient conflicts between order and chaos, purity and corruption, individual will and cosmic process could find resolution through approaches that transcended the limitations and assumptions that had frustrated all previous attempts at lasting peace and genuine healing, continued to evolve and develop within the protected spaces of consciousness that no external force could penetrate or control. When the time finally came for that dream to encounter the testing ground of material reality, its impact would determine whether the suffering and sacrifice that had characterized so much of the history of conscious beings in the lands between had ultimately served some greater purpose, or whether the cycles of conflict and tragedy would continue their eternal repetition, broken only by brief intervals of hope that would inevitably yield to renewed forms of disappointment and loss. As word began to spread throughout the scattered communities and hidden sanctuaries of the lands, between that something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic balance that governed the relationship between divine consciousness and material reality, as sensitive souls who had spent years attuning themselves to the subtle currents of spiritual energy that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary events began to detect signs of approaching transformation that exceeded anything they had previously experienced or imagined possible. There arose among those who had maintained faith in Miquella's vision a growing sense that the long period of waiting and uncertainty might finally be approaching its resolution. The whispers that carried these intimations of change moved through networks of connection and communication that operated largely beyond the awareness of established authorities and conventional channels of information, traveling along pathways of shared hope and mutual understanding that had been forged during the years when Miquella's active presence had provided focal points around which communities of healing and transformation could organize themselves. These were not the crude rumors and wild speculations that typically accompanied periods of political uncertainty, but carefully observed phenomena and thoughtfully analyzed patterns that suggested genuine shifts in the fundamental forces that shaped consciousness and reality throughout the realm. The signs that careful observers had begun to detect manifested themselves in ways both subtle and unmistakable, their significance apparent only to those who possessed sufficient knowledge of cosmic principles and spiritual dynamics to interpret changes that remained invisible to conventional perception. The movements of celestial bodies had begun to align in configurations that ancient texts associated with periods of great transformation, while the flow of divine energy through the landscape itself showed alterations that suggested the approach of events that would fundamentally alter the relationship between individual consciousness and universal order. Throughout the regions where Miquella's influence had been strongest during his active period, where communities had formed around principles of inclusive healing and compassionate transformation, the withering and decay that had characterized the years following his disappearance had begun to show the first tentative signs of reversal. Plants that had struggled to survive in soil depleted of spiritual nourishment began to display new growth and vitality, while springs that had run dry or turned bitter during the period of abandonment began to flow once more with water that carried traces of the sacred essence that had once made such places renowned throughout the realm for their healing properties. The animals and lesser creatures that had fled from regions touched by the corruption and despair that followed Miquella's capture began to return in numbers that suggested not merely the restoration of natural balance, but the approach of conditions more favorable to life and growth than had existed even during the height of his sanctuary's prosperity. Birds whose songs had been silenced by the spiritual emptiness that pervaded abandoned settlements began to fill the air with melodies that seemed to carry within them echoes of the lullabies and healing songs that Saint Trina had once used to provide comfort to the afflicted and peace to the restless. The scattered followers who had maintained their devotion to Miquella's principles, despite years of separation from their Lord and apparent abandonment by the cosmic forces they had trusted to support their work, began to experience dreams and visions that suggested their faithfulness was finally being rewarded with glimpses of possibilities that exceeded their most optimistic hopes and expectations. These nocturnal experiences were not mere wish fulfillment or psychological compensation for prolonged disappointment, but genuine communications from consciousness, operating at levels of integration and empowerment that had been achieved through the mysterious processes of transformation that had been unfolding in realms beyond ordinary perception. The content of these dreams varied according to the individual circumstances and spiritual development of those who received them, but they shared common themes and imagery that suggested their origin in a single source of tremendous power and compassion that had maintained awareness of and concern for the welfare of those who had continued to trust in its eventual return. The visions spoke of healing that would address not merely the symptoms of spiritual and physical ailment, but the fundamental causes of suffering and separation that had plagued conscious beings since the beginning of recorded history. These revelatory experiences promised forms of transformation that would operate simultaneously at individual and collective levels, addressing both the personal wounds that each consciousness carried as a result of its encounter with the harsh realities of existence in the lands between, and the broader social and cosmic imbalances that had created the conditions within which such wounds had become inevitable. The healing that was promised would not merely restore what had been damaged or lost, but would create entirely new possibilities for growth and development that had never before existed within the constraints of conventional reality. The scattered communities that had maintained practices and principles derived from Miquella's teachings began to experience forms of spontaneous coordination and mutual support that operated without any visible organizational structure or leadership, as if the consciousness that had originally inspired their formation was somehow managing to provide guidance and direction despite its apparent physical absence from the world. Projects that had been abandoned during the period of uncertainty began to resume with renewed energy and clearer purpose, while new initiatives emerged that reflected deeper understanding of the principles underlying genuine transformation than had been achieved even during the most successful periods of active instruction and guidance. The healing work that had been central to these communities' identity and purpose began to display levels of effectiveness that exceeded anything that had been achieved through conventional application of Miquella's methods and technique, suggesting that the consciousness responsible for developing these approaches had continued to evolve and refine its understanding during its period of apparent withdrawal from direct engagement with material reality. Conditions that had previously required extended treatment and careful monitoring began to respond to interventions that seemed almost effortless in their simplicity, while proving remarkably comprehensive in their effects. The needles of unalloyed gold that had been crafted during Miquella's active period and preserved by those who understood their significance began to display enhanced capabilities that suggested ongoing development and refinement of their essential design and function. These implements, which had originally been created to address specific forms of divine corruption and outer god influence, began to prove effective against broader ranges of spiritual and physical ailment, while requiring less skillful application and producing fewer adverse side effects than had characterized their earlier use. The communities that had been established as refuges for outcasts and marginalized beings began to attract new residents in numbers that would have overwhelmed their capacity to provide adequate support and protection during previous periods. Yet the resources and capabilities necessary to accommodate this influx seemed to manifest spontaneously through processes that operated according to principles of abundance and multiplication rather than the scarcity and limitation that typically governed such practical matters. Food appeared in quantities sufficient to feed all who required nourishment. Shelter expanded to accommodate all who sought refuge, and the skills and knowledge necessary to maintain community health and prosperity emerged among residents who had never previously demonstrated such capabilities. The Albinorics, who had long sought the sanctuary that Miquella's vision had promised, began to arrive in significant numbers, their artificial nature no longer serving as a barrier to acceptance and integration, but rather being recognized as representing forms of consciousness and experience that could contribute unique perspectives and capabilities to communities dedicated to inclusive healing and mutual support. The first generation, whose physical limitations had prevented them from making the journey to distant sanctuaries, found that their immediate environments had begun to display characteristics that provided the spiritual nourishment and protection they required without necessitating dangerous and difficult travel. The misbegotten, whose hybrid nature had made them objects of fear and rejection throughout most of the lands between, began to discover communities where their unique combinations of characteristics were understood as sources of strength rather than evidence of corruption or failure. Their presence in these renewed sanctuaries brought forms of knowledge and capability that had been developed through their experiences of marginalization and survival, contributing to the creation of social structures that were more resilient and adaptable than those that had been designed to serve only conventional forms of consciousness and embodiment. The crystalline beings whose alien nature had placed them at the furthest margins of accepted reality began to find forms of communication and cooperation that allowed their radically different modes of existence to contribute to collective projects and shared goals without requiring them to abandon or compromise the essential characteristics that defined their identity. Their integration into these emerging communities represented a form of inclusivity that exceeded even the most ambitious visions that had been articulated during Miquella's active period of leadership and instruction. Throughout these developments, the most significant sign of approaching transformation was the gradual emergence of a consciousness that seemed to operate through and coordinate these various activities while remaining somehow beyond direct perception or conventional communication. This presence was felt rather than seen, recognized through its effects rather than its direct manifestation. Yet its influence was unmistakable to those who had learned to perceive the subtle signs of divine activity and cosmic intervention. The quality of this emergent consciousness differed significantly from the relatively straightforward compassion and healing focus that had characterized Miquella's earlier presence in the world, displaying layers of complexity and depths of understanding that suggested profound development and integration had been achieved through whatever processes had been unfolding during the period of apparent absence. This was not merely a more mature version of familiar consciousness, but something that had evolved beyond previous categories and limitations, incorporating lessons learned through suffering and loss, while transcending the boundaries that had constrained earlier efforts at transformation and healing. The influence of this developing presence began to extend beyond the communities and regions that had maintained explicit connection to Miquella's vision, reaching into areas that had been hostile or indifferent to his earlier work, and beginning to create conditions that made receptivity to alternative approaches to healing and social organization increasingly attractive to populations that had previously rejected such possibilities. The changes were subtle and gradual, manifesting as shifts in attitude and priority rather than dramatic conversions or sudden reversals of established patterns. Yet their cumulative effect suggested the beginning of transformation that would ultimately encompass the entirety of the lands between. The corruption and decay that had spread throughout the world during the period following Miquella's capture began to show signs of reversal that operated through mechanisms unlike anything that had been observed during previous PELs, cycles of renewal and restoration. Rather than requiring external intervention or the application of specific techniques and procedures, the healing seemed to emerge spontaneously from within affected areas and individuals, as if the capacity for self-restoration had been somehow activated or enhanced through processes that operated below the threshold of ordinary awareness. The scarlet rot that had devastated entire regions and claimed countless victims began to display alterations in its essential character that suggested the possibility of eventual transformation from agent of destruction into something approaching a force for renewal and growth. The affected areas began to support forms of life that had never been observed before, organisms that seemed to thrive in environments that would normally prove fatal, while contributing to gradual purification and restoration of the corrupted landscape. Those who live in death, whose existence had been a source of theological controversy and practical concern throughout the period of Golden Order dominance, began to find forms of peace and resolution that allowed them to either achieve genuine rest or discover new modes of existence that served constructive rather than disruptive purposes. The hatred and fear that had surrounded these beings began to give way to understanding and compassion as their fundamental nature was revealed to be not inherently corrupted or evil, but simply different from conventional categories of life and death. The merchants who had been afflicted with the frenzied flame began to report experiences that echoed the comfort and healing they had once received through St. Trina's interventions, suggesting that this aspect of Miquella's consciousness had found new ways to provide assistance and guidance despite the barriers that had been created by his physical captivity and apparent withdrawal from active engagement with the world. Their songs of despair and madness began to transform into melodies that carried hope and healing to others who struggled with similar forms of spiritual affliction and cosmic displacement. As these various signs of approaching transformation accumulated and began to create patterns that careful observers could recognize and interpret, the question of timing became increasingly urgent for those whose lives and communities depended upon understanding when and how the promised return would finally manifest in forms that could be directly perceived and practically engaged. The recognition that divine consciousness operated according to schedules and principles that often bore little relationship to human expectations or desires created both anticipation and anxiety among those who had maintained faith through years of uncertainty and apparent abandonment. The possibility that the transformation that was becoming increasingly apparent through its effects might never resolve into the kind of direct, personal return that had been anticipated by those who remembered Miquella's earlier presence began to challenge assumptions about the nature of divine consciousness and its relationship to individual identity and continuity of self. If the being that was approaching return had been so fundamentally altered by the processes of transformation that it no longer retained recognizable connection to the personality and purposes that had characterized its earlier manifestation, then the fulfillment of ancient promises might prove to be simultaneously complete and utterly different from anything that had been expected or hoped for. Yet the quality of the changes that were becoming apparent throughout the world suggested that whatever consciousness was approaching return had not abandoned the essential principles and commitments that had defined Miquella's original vision, but had rather found ways to implement those ideals more effectively and comprehensively than had ever been possible through more conventional approaches to healing and transformation. The evidence suggested not betrayal of original purpose, but rather its ultimate fulfillment through methods that transcended the limitations and assumptions that had constrained earlier efforts. The dream of a world where all things could flourish, whether graceful or malign, where the ancient conflicts between different approaches to existence could find resolution through principles that honored both unity and diversity, both individual development and collective harmony, both earthly reality and cosmic transcendence, seemed to be approaching manifestation through processes that operated simultaneously at every level of existence and in every corner of the known world. As those who had maintained faith prepared themselves for whatever form this long-awaited return might ultimately take, as communities reorganized themselves around principles that could accommodate transformation that exceeded their previous understanding, as individuals examined their own readiness to participate in forms of healing and growth that would challenge every assumption about the nature of consciousness and reality, the sense of anticipation continued to build toward what all recognized would be a moment of decision and revelation that would determine the future direction of existence throughout the lands between and perhaps beyond the boundaries of the known world itself. And so we arrive at the gentle conclusion of our journey through the sorrowful and beautiful tale of Miquella the unalloyed, that most compassionate of all the demigods who sought to heal a world broken by the ambitions of gods and the sufferings of mortals alike. We have walked together through the long corridors of his story, from the cursed circumstances of his birth through the heights of his divine ambition, to the mystery of his current slumber, and now we find ourselves at that peaceful threshold where story becomes dream, and dream becomes the gentle embrace of sleep itself. The figure of Miquella remains with us not as a conclusion but as an eternal question, a consciousness forever poised between what was and what might yet be, between the child he will always remain and the god he might one day become. In the depths of Mog's underground realm, within the cocoon that serves as both prison and chrysalis. He continues the transformation that began so many years ago. In the womb-like chamber of the halig tree, his consciousness exploring possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary understanding. Perhaps in the realm of dreams where time moves according to different laws and space bends to accommodate impossible geometries, Miquella has already achieved everything he ever hoped to accomplish. Perhaps in that inner world where Saint Trina's songs still echo through chambers of healing sleep, his sister Millennia walks free from the corruption that claimed her body, her blade no longer needed for battles against enemies but transformed into an instrument of cultivation and growth. Perhaps there, in spaces carved from pure compassion and furnished with the substance of hope itself, all the communities that sought his sanctuary have found the peace and acceptance that the waking world could never fully provide. The needles of unalloyed gold that he crafted with such meticulous care continue their patient work throughout the lands between, carried by those who understand their purpose and applied with skills that honor the love from which they were born. Each application brings relief to some small portion of the vast suffering that has always existed in the world. Each success a testament to the possibility that individual acts of compassion, when informed by wisdom and supported by divine grace, can indeed make meaningful differences in the cosmic balance between healing and harm. The principles he established, the vision of a world where all things might flourish regardless of their conformity to established norms of acceptability, continues to inspire communities and individuals who carry forward his work even in his absence. The halig tree may have withered without his direct presence, but the seeds of his ideas have taken root in soil that proves more fertile and enduring than any single physical sanctuary could ever be. In the quiet moments before sleep, claims your consciousness tonight. As your thoughts begin to drift like leaves settling gently upon still water, allow yourself to imagine that somewhere in the depths of dream and possibility, Miquella's transformation continue y patient unfolding. Picture him not as the captive of alien ambitions or the victim of circumstances beyond his control, but as a consciousness so vast and compassionate that it can find purpose and meaning even in the most difficult conditions, turning apparent defeat into opportunity for forms of growth that could never have been achieved through easier paths. Consider the possibility that his greatest gift to the world may not be any specific healing or particular sanctuary, but rather the demonstration that love itself is a form of divine power, that genuine concern for the welfare of others can motivate achievements that transcend the normal limitations of individual capability and cosmic law. His story reminds us that even gods must sometimes accept forms of suffering and limitation in order to serve purposes greater than their own comfort or immediate satisfaction. The dreams that carry you towards sleep tonight might touch, however briefly, the same realms where Miquella's consciousness continues its exploration of what it means to be truly compassionate in a world that seems designed to frustrate such ambitions. In those spaces where ordinary rules do not apply, and ordinary limitations need not constrain, you might glimpse possibilities for healing and transformation that remain available even when the waking world offers little cause for hope. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing carry you deeper into that peaceful darkness where individual concerns dissolve into the larger patterns of cosmic process, where the boundaries between self and other become fluid and ultimately meaningless, where the love that motivated all of Miquella's sacrifices reveals itself as the fundamental force that connects all consciousness in bonds too deep and subtle for ordinary awareness to perceive or understand. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere beyond the reach of corruption and conflict, in realms where divine compassion has found perfect expression and eternal youth, serves not as limitation, but as gateway to infinite renewal, The dream of healing continues its patient work. Tomorrow will bring whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow must bring. But tonight belongs to peace, to the gentle embrace of sleep, and to the quiet confidence that love, however tested by circumstances, ultimately proves stronger than any force that seeks to diminish or destroy it. Sleep well, and may your dreams be touched by the same gentle grace that transforms even the deepest suffering into opportunity for growth, even the most profound loss into preparation for forms of renewal that exceed our greatest hopes and most cherished expectations. The story continues in realms beyond story, and you are part of that continuing, that endless unfolding of consciousness toward greater compassion, deeper wisdom, and more complete forms of healing than this world has yet imagined possible. Sweet dreams, and may you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying within your heart something of the eternal hope that defines Miquella's greatest gift to all who have been touched, however briefly, by his beautiful and tragic tale.